All right then. I should be online. Let's make absolutely sure that I am. All right, it's saying I'm live. Okay then. Well, all right, that means I should be. I don't suppose I should waste time waiting for confirmation of that. I'm going to trust what the computer says here. So then, as promised, now that I have reached the milestone of 500 subscribers, I'm going to answer all of your questions as well as responding to some old comments that I haven't gotten around to replying to. So first of all, thank you to everyone for subscribing and watching my videos and all the rest of that. I greatly appreciate it, and greatly appreciate all the stimulating discussions that have come out of those videos in the comments section and in all other venues. Also, thank you to the people a few minutes ago who were kind enough to confirm for me that all of my equipment was working. So then, so let's get started. Now, the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to go through comments that have been left to me in a few older videos because those go from a while back. I'm going to go through all of those that I've missed, reply to them, then go to the questions that were left on the video in which I announced my Q&A session, and then go through all of those. And once I've answered those, I would be happy to answer any other questions that anyone might have in the chat, or if it comes to that, just, shoot the shit with whoever's there. So yeah, that should be fun. Also, one other thing, because I gather that this is all probably going to take quite a while, because I've actually received quite a few questions, many of which are excellent. As some of you might be able to see, I'm wearing a Game of Thrones shirt. It's got Tyrion Lannister on it, and it says, "That's what I do. I drink and I know things." And I suppose today I'm going to be demonstrating both of those capacities. So then, let's get started. Okay, let's go to my comments. I'm going to transition here to allowing you to see my screen. So here goes with that. All right, then, you should see my screen here. Now, on an older video that I uploaded about libertarianism and immigration, here are all the comments, and the one in particular that I want to bring attention to is this one by Todd Magnuson. You may be able to see that it was put up 2 months ago, and I just haven't gotten around to replying. So I'm just going to read the comment, and I'm going to answer it, because as I said, I do have an answer in my head. I was just too lazy to write the thing. So here goes. So I'm going to argue definitions slightly for a very recent break-off of libertarian roots. I think what we see here with the immigration issue is less libertarian versus libertarian and more libertarian classical liberalism versus propertarianism coined by Kurt Doolittle. Reminds me of a Robert Weaver circa 1940s science plus data. Essentially, the problem with many libertarians is they ignore the commons entirely. They ignore structure in many ways via ethnicity and effects of social trust and capital, genetics, culture, in favor of purely per-individual economic arguments with almost predictable reflectivity. This especially pertains to the subset of libertarians and caps. I guess I pick on them so much, being that I traveled in those circles briefly. I disagree with that the argument will go on forever. I'll explain in a minute what he's referring to. And suggest or argue that the competing arguments will fracture the camp into primarily one of those two camps at some future inflection point. I could be dead wrong, but it just seems like the normal progression of unresolved arguments is more toward moral chasms versus constant battles, similar to religion and to the Reformation. Sure, there was still Christianity, but there were distinct moral divides, long-term and short-term, time emphasis, moral policing, etc. Anyways, hope to read your response in a few days. Well, Todd, as you probably can see, obviously I've kept you waiting a lot longer than a few days. So, to clarify for anyone who may not know the context of this, the video on which this comment was left was one in which I talked about libertarianism and the immigration issue. And essentially what I argued is that there were many problems pertaining to vagueness that clouded the debate. And so there were two camps of libertarians, one the more paleo-libertarian camp, the Hoppian-style camp, who were more anti-immigration. I guess I'd throw Lou Rockwell and Tom Woods into this camp as well. And then there are the more left libertarian, open borders types, or at least the ones who think that libertarian principle requires this, and so on. And essentially what I said is that if you examine the situation, and you examine both of the answers to the immigration question, whether and you examine both sides of the policy, both policy prescriptions, you will see rights violations on both sides. And so then the only recourse left is to do a utility calculation about which side of the policy, which particular decision will result in fewer rights violations or less egregious rights violations, and so on. And since there's an element of subjectivity to this, there's no way to resolve the dispute definitively. And that will result in endless bickering. Now, what Mr. Magnuson here is doing is that he's making a reference to propertarianism, which is this ideology put together by a blogger named Kurt Doolittle, who I believe lives in Ukraine, actually. And I mean, there are certain elements to what he's saying, and without going into any kind of full-throated analysis or discussion of Doolittle and his views, the basic thing to understand for the context of this comment is that Doolittle believes that natural rights libertarianism of the Rothbardian style, or even the Hoppian style, sort of ANCAP libertarianism, that sort of thing, he believes that it pays insufficient attention to the free rider problem, and that's where the claim comes from that it ignores the commons. Now, by commons, he doesn't necessarily mean simply communally owned property or some lake or body of water that everyone partakes of, or a forest that everyone is in, and it's not like literal physical common property necessarily, but other things that pertain to the public, I suppose. So that would be like the genetic constitution of the population, the culture of the people in your society, these sorts of communal things. That's what he means by the commons. And what he claims is that natural rights libertarianism, because of its methodological individualism, because of its focus on individual property rights and the rights and privileges and the things that individual property owners may or may not do under that particular system, you get insufficient attention paid to these things. And one of the consequences of that, the argument goes, is that ethnic solidarity or racial solidarity in some society may fall apart as a result of overemphasis on individualism and property and so forth. So to give an example, something perhaps like the following is claimed would happen. So let's say you have some community, it is, let's say, entirely white, and then a black man comes in wanting to buy the property of one of the members of this community. The member from whom the black man wants to buy the house or the plot of land or whatever it is actually happens to be willing to sell. He completes the sale. The black guy now owns the property, and this then begins an incursion into the formerly entirely white community by a different group. With that beginning, then comes the possibility of additional inflows of blacks, and so the racial makeup of the community is completely disrupted. And because of biological racial differences, and here we get all sorts of race realist arguments that I won't bother to rehash because I trust they're at least vaguely familiar to most of you, the character of the community in question will change, probably irretrievably, and so any of the previous qualities of that community, be it high trust or what have you, disappear. So the community falls apart, and it falls apart allegedly as a result of following to the letter these individualistic libertarian property norms. All right, so now there's a couple things to say here. First, before I really get into my issues with Doolittle and his whole approach, and again, as I said, I don't intend this to be any kind of full-throated discussion of what he has to say. I'm just going to focus on his methodology and his approach to analyzing human societies and so forth. The thing here is that he takes a very empirical approach, and I'll get to that in a minute. The first general point that I need to make, though, is that there is nothing about libertarian property rights theory or libertarian property norms whatsoever. Let me just switch back to me again, I guess, that necessarily requires that you not favor such things as, say, the preservation of the white race, or whatever race you happen to be a member of, racial solidarity, ethnic solidarity, religious solidarity, cultural homogeneity, all of these things. You're not required to reject these things or to repudiate them simply on account of the fact that you happen to subscribe to a libertarian property rights theory and believe in those particular property norms. Just because you believe, for example, that unowned property can only come to be owned by an individual who in some way, let's say, mixes his labor with the unowned property, and thereby creates discernible, intersubjectively valid physical borders around whatever piece of property he happens to have brought under his own dominion, such that it then becomes his. And just because you accept that, and just because you accept the further principle that once unowned property is brought under ownership in this way, the only way that it then can be transferred legitimately is either through voluntary exchange or gift or bequest or something like that. And anything which doesn't fall into those rules comes to be an illegitimate property transfer. It's considered theft under libertarian law, etc., etc. Now, just because you believe in those basic norms, it does not follow that you therefore have to jettison any attachment to race, to culture, to religion, or to any of these things. Notice nothing on these matters whatsoever has been said. All right? And you are presumably in these sort of arrangements, as the owner of some particular piece of property, given utter freedom to contract with or not contract with whomever you wish. So, for example, let's say you have this purely white community, and that within this community there is a strong sense of racial solidarity, and that all people in there are conscious of that and don't want to lose it. Now, if someone of another race comes along seeking to buy something, they're not going to sell. Or at least you're going to have to offer them a substantially higher price before they're willing to consider selling. The price may be so substantially higher as to be essentially infinitely higher, or so high as to be outside of what anyone who happens to come along would be willing to pay. It all depends on the question of how strong the bonds of that community happen to be they religious, cultural, racial, etc. How strong are those bonds? And the same goes for any other group division. If you only want to live with Catholics and some non-Catholic says, hey, I'd like to buy your house, well, if you're serious about that, if you really mean that, you're not going to sell as readily to a non-Catholic as you would to a Catholic, because you understand what the consequences of doing that would be for the makeup of the community in which you live. So the question is one of already presently existing solidarity and the strength of the ties within that particular community. Nothing about these libertarian property norms implies anything about that whatsoever. You are, under libertarian property rights theory, allowed to buy or sell to whomever you wish for whatever reason you wish. And so having these attachments, the ones I've alluded to, is not at all precluded. You can have a racist or anti-Protestant or what have you batch of people who are libertarians, provided that they follow those property norms, do not aggress upon other legitimate owners of property, and so on. But there's nothing that says that they can't buy or sell to whomever they wish and tailor their selling of their own property in such a way as to ensure the continuity of the cultural, racial, etc. makeup of the community in which they live. That's just not precluded there. I suppose perhaps what's being alluded to is to say, well, perhaps some individual will be more concerned for his own individual advantage and will not think of the community and so on. Well, perhaps. I mean, that's logically possible. It could happen. But again, the question is, how strong are those relevant community bonds? If they aren't strong, if they've been weakened, if they've been degraded by something or other, some factor, whatever it is, the fact of the matter is, whether you have libertarian property norms in place or some other set of norms, isn't going to make a difference to whether the community survives in the long run, because the will to survive simply isn't there anymore. Right? Those things have degraded. That's the sense of importance being attached to those things is gone for whatever reason. We can debate the reasons, but the point is that they're gone. And if those things are gone, and since they're at the center of what keeps the community cohesive, it's not going to stay cohesive. I mean, the question of what the property norms are is no longer really relevant. I mean, even if you had a state in charge where some law was promulgated to the effect that a white person may not sell his property to a non-white person, well, this law, presumably, if it existed in any community, would exist because there was some level of at least implicit agreement with the policy. And if opposition to it was strong enough, people would change it. So again, we're back to the question of how strong are those bonds, because those bonds are what is originary. And when they degrade, everything degrades. The question of the property norms or the legal structure no longer matters as such. So if you're arguing that there is something about libertarian property rights theory which necessarily requires you to forsake all of those things, this is not true. You can forsake them, or you can, adhere to them and cleave to them strongly. You can do whatever you like. Either thing is compatible, and whether those things persist is going to depend on the character of the community. It's going to depend on the character of the people in the community, the sort of people that they are, and so forth. That's what matters here. The specific property norms really don't come into the discussion. So that's the first point to make. The other point, specifically relating to Doolittle's whole idea of the commons, there is something I'd like to point your attention to for a minute. I'm going to go to a Facebook thread in which there was a discussion between Kurt Doolittle, some other people, although I'm not going to read what they say because that's not important, and Stefan Kinsella about Doolittle's own idea of property rights and the whole thing of the commons and that whole notion, and Kinsella's approach. And as I read through the thread and comment on it, I'm going to highlight the differences in methodology between Doolittle and Kinsella. And Kinsella, for those of you who don't know, is a libertarian philosopher of law, property rights theorist. He's written a lot about intellectual property law, but he's much more interested, it seems to me, in rights theory. So he's in many ways sort of the successor to Hans Hermann Hoppe. He's carrying on that sort of tradition, that way of doing things. And as I said, I'm going to highlight a fundamental methodological disagreement between these two men. And the methodological disagreement that Kinsella has with Doolittle is exactly the same methodological disagreement that I have with him. And as I'm going to show, it's all going to come down ultimately to epistemology. So here it goes. I'm going to switch once again to my screen for you here. And here we go. So so I trust you can see the post. By the way, this isn't my actual Facebook account. I'm signed into a fake account. This is just so that I could get this all up on the screen, but this isn't really my account or anything. Okay, so just to read through it very quickly, Doolittle says conservative plus libertarian plus progressive, ethics and institutions. Conservatives are right on morality, right on social capital, wrong on institutions. Libertarians are right on institutions, right on economics, and wrong on morality. Progressives are wrong on literally everything. Rothbardianism was a tragedy. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the comments here, but I'm going to go down to where Kinsella and Doolittle really get going. So here we go. I'm going to start with this long comment here from Kurt Doolittle. He says, well, I criticize Haidt too. He's referring to Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist. Jonathan Haidt who talks about kind of fundamental moral orientations of conservatives as opposed to liberals, and why they happen to disagree, and how those differences in orientation explain the persistence of disagreements between them. So here we go. He says, well, I criticize Haidt too, but largely because Haidt is talking to progressives like his former self, whose minds he wants to change, not us. And he gives some numbered propositions. 0. He does not give us much attention, although it is commonly discussed in the field now that Haidt has become a conservative libertarian, as am I. He now correctly attributes values to norms. Libertarians proper do not correctly understand and attribute value to norms. Not sure what that means, but okay. 1. He correctly identifies social capital as the conservative objective, but does not really address it any. 2. He does not address the gender distribution or how it affects voting. 3. He missed out on Todd's family structure and early property rights influences. 4. He does not address the destruction of the family. 5. He's not an economist, so he does not address our central argument that liberty creates prosperity and prosperity choice, and freedom to obtain that which each of us desires, no matter how different. However, it is possible to construct Kling's arguments from Haidt's research, but it's not possible to construct Kling's arguments from science. He is still relying on, he didn't write that, the language of morality. Kling's simplification is useful as a literary device for helping readers put yet another frame of reference around our political differences. Just like all analogies, they help us to understand that which we are unfamiliar with, but analogies are not descriptions of causal relations. It troubles me because Kling has had one central insight that he has not put into book form that is supported by research, PSST, don't know what that is, yet he goes off on yet another literary expedition here without addressing values of the dialogue. Regarding propertarianism, in my work I'm interested in how to completely and totally include all moral criteria in property rights that are adjudicable under law. This makes it possible, regardless of moral bias, to eliminate demand for the state as a mediator of disputes. Haidt made the connection between evolutionary biology and necessity and our moral instincts. I'm just transferring those into economic language. So here's Kinsella's reply. He asks, what is PSST? And then it says, as for, quote, I'm interested in how to completely and totally include all moral criteria and property rights that are adjudicable under law. Kinsella says, not sure exactly what this means, but it seems clear that not all moral rules imply or are to be enforced by property rights. At most, it is only a subset of moral rules that are implemented in terms of property rights. Okay, Doolittle's reply. PSST, Patterns of Sustainable Specialization in Trade. I think it's the reason for the Austrian business cycle, and he came out with it at the right time, but he hasn't done enough research to flesh it out and represent it empirically. It's unfortunate. It's actually how Greenspan approached the economy when he was doing good analysis like cotton production, and has nothing to do with this silly belief that financial instruments could reduce risk of contagion. No idea why he thought that, but he bought it like everyone else. Doolittle goes on. Property rights. Well, the fact that one can express all is different from whether one chooses to express all. The point being that in any given polity, there is some point of suppression of free riding, theft, via available market means, the courts. That demand for the state drops below that which allows people to form one. Okay, so this is where it gets serious. Now, here, Doolittle is talking about free riding. And he's equating it with theft. So essentially what he says is that the reason the state exists is that there's a kind of demand for it. The reason that there's a demand for it is that one of the functions of the state is to prevent free riding, to stop free riding. There's a certain commons, and there is an incentive, or at least a temptation, to free ride off of those commons. That is to exploit a resource which is under public dominion, and for which, and so if you exploit it, you don't individually bear the cost of exploitation, but you do reap the benefits of exploitation. So there's a kind of you're sort of he's trying to frame it as theft, really, that the resource is owned by the public or controlled by it. He's saying that because of that, no one really has any individual connection to or ownership of that resource as an individual, and so you can exploit the resource and derive the benefits from exploiting it individually, and yet not really harm yourself terribly much individually. And so from that individualistic vantage, the incentive is to exploit the resource. Okay, and so from that, he then equates free riding to theft. And this is where we get to the heart of what I call the methodological disagreement between people like Doolittle and then actual paleo-libertarians like Kinsella and myself. So Kinsella just says, you can't equate free riding with theft like this. Doolittle replies, Stefan, I can, because humans do. The question is, given that humans do, how can one arbitrarily not? It's nice that Rothbard tried to define theft as aggression, but specifically allowed for deception, which is convenient for a parasitic ghetto ethicist, but science says otherwise. Okay. Morality is not determined by aggression, but by involuntary transfer. Demand for the state will exist as long as there's no private court means by which to enforce morality, restitution for theft. If you want to cover a praxeological law discover a praxeological law of human cooperation, that's one of them. Cheers. And then he sort of tries to be a smart aleck here. I don't know. I guess this is his idea of being clever. Burying Rothbard's failed ghetto ethics one paragraph at a time. Okay, so all right, I'm going to pause here. So what's going on here fundamentally is that he's saying that if you look at Rothbard's work on property rights, like in Ethics of Liberty, for example, he defines a certain property rights theory, and then he says that aggression, and by extension crime, really comes down to violations of those property rights, according to that theory. And so anything which doesn't do that isn't crime, and one of the results of that is that things like blackmail, slander, libel, etc., don't come off as crimes because you don't actually own your reputation. It doesn't make sense to say, under his theory, that you have any kind of property right in your reputation, because your reputation ultimately really is just part of the content of other people's minds with respect to you. It's what other people think about you, and how can you possibly own what's in other people's minds? It doesn't make sense. And so therefore these things aren't crimes. Doolittle objects to this. He wants to insist that they are. Now notice what he does. Kinsella is accusing Doolittle of equivocating here because he's taking two concepts, free riding and theft, and treating them as though they are the same. And Kinsella insists that you can't do this. Now, what is Doolittle's reply? Well, he says that if you examine human societies empirically, you find that empirically, human beings do indeed look down upon free riding and treat it as though it is a kind of theft. And because they treat it that way, therefore, for that reason, it is to be counted as theft. In other words, it's theft because people say it is and because they empirically seem to behave as though it is. And so the question of what the definition of theft is, what the definition of free riding is, and whether it is implied conceptually within those definitions that the two are the same thing, isn't even a relevant question for Doolittle. He doesn't care about definitions. What he wants to say is, okay, what's happening? Let's take a look. Let's be empirical about this. And the kind of rationalistic considerations where you just sort of set down a definition and then you deduce the implications of that definition, that's irrelevant for him. That doesn't even come up for him. So let's continue with the thread. Okay, so Kinsella goes on to say, theft and free riding are different things. To equate them is to argue by semantics, to engage in equivocation. See, like I said. The reason why people are against theft is based on its normal meaning. To then just assert free riding equals theft is to engage in equivocation as far as I can see. That's like IP types saying that copying information is stealing. That's a bad argument too. Okay, Doolittle's reply. So theft is whatever people say it is? Is that what you're saying? No, that's not what Kinsella's saying at all. Doolittle's just misunderstanding him. The question isn't what people say something is or how they behave with respect to something. The question is, what's the definition of something conceptually? Let's stipulate a definition and reason consistently from that definition. That's what he's doing. So Doolittle's just misunderstanding Kinsella here, and he's got that little winky emoji because, again, he thinks he's being clever. But okay, let's go on here. So some normative rules are conveniently true, and other rational rules are conveniently true as long as they fit doctrine. No, not at all. That's not what he's saying. What Kinsella is saying is that you stipulate a definition beforehand, and then you stick to that definition. That's it. All right. But then he goes on to say, but rules are not true simply because they violate doctrine. There's no question of violating doctrine. You're just declaring a definition and reasoning from the definition. There's no question of doctrine yet. There is no doctrine yet. We haven't gotten there. It's just a definition. But anyway, but rules are not true simply because they violate doctrine, not because they're either normative or rational. Is that what you're saying? No, that's not what he's saying. But Doolittle goes on. Murder, violence, destruction, theft by physical appropriation, theft by fraud using omission, free riding, privatization of commons, socialization of losses, conspiracy, invasion, conquest, all deprive others of that which they have acted to obtain an interest in against their will, i.e. theft. The taking of that which is not obtained by voluntary exchange or first use. Humans reject universally and punish universally theft. In legal terms, however, resolvable under the common law. The word we use for involuntary transfer is theft. That's the most general categorical name we have available to us. Now, the problem that arises with cooperation is called free riding. The problem of free riding is how it's discussed in literature. In the context of social science, Okay, I'm not going to read every word of this, but essentially what he's saying is, like I said, that free riding is theft because people seem to treat it that way. They seem to empirically behave that way. Now, look at Kinsella's response here. So he says, so theft is whatever people say it is. And he answers, no, you have to be clear and consistent in definitions. If you want to redefine the word theft to mean free riding, that's fine, if awkward. But then it just means free riding. It does not mean taking by force a material resource owned by a person, which is what theft usually means. We all agree that the latter type of theft should be prohibited. What is controversial is the idea that free riding should be prohibited. You seem to want to argue free riding is like theft in some respects and therefore should be treated the same. You are free to make this argument, but calling it theft is not an argument. Kinsella goes on to say, he quotes him, humans reject universally and punish, Okay, yes, but not just involuntary transfer, in particular involuntary transfer of an owned resource. You can't then argue that free riding is also an involuntary transfer because it's not an involuntary transfer of any owned resource. That's the problem. Okay, so again, what Kinsella is saying is the commons aren't owned, okay? According to the property rights theory set out by people like him, what we call the commons aren't owned by anyone. If they're not owned by anyone, then by definition they can't be stolen. No one owns them. There's no one from whom it is stolen. And in addition to that, the only thing that can be owned is a scarce physical resource. So if it's not a scarce physical resource that is owned by some definite person or persons, it cannot be stolen. All right? So theft, and again, this is just Kinsella setting down a definition. Theft is defined as the involuntary transfer of some owned scarce physical resource from one person to another. Free riding, however, is defined as exploiting some resource and deriving benefits from its use without having to pay associated costs. That's how free riding is generally understood. Now, those aren't the same. Those definitions mean that they aren't the same thing, and hence Kinsella is saying that free riding isn't theft. The definitions imply different things. What Doolittle is saying is, to hell with the definitions. Who cares? Humans empirically treat them the same way, and so therefore we also should. Well, the problem with this, and again, this is where my methodological disagreement with him comes out, is his extreme empiricism. What Doolittle winds up saying is, like, who cares about definitions? Who cares about consistent reasoning and so forth? And he'll have to say that because there is nothing in the nature of empirical human behavior that imposes upon it a requirement of consistency. There's nothing that says that human beings have to behave in a rationally consistent manner, and indeed they often don't. So if you have a certain definition of theft and a certain definition of free riding, and those definitions are different, but people behave as if they're the same, well, then they're wrong to do that. What, at least according to people like Kinsella, what he's saying is they're behaving inconsistently. And so if you want to base your approach to social theory simply on how people behave, you're not going to have a consistent approach to social theory because people don't behave consistently. If you want to have a social theory that is consistent, that is free of contradictions, then you have to set down definitions, and you have to stick to those definitions. And to hell with how people behave, because they don't behave consistently. That's really the fundamental issue. And I have to say, I'm on Kinsella's side here, because, again, if you take that hyper-empirical approach, you will eventually at some point necessarily have to embrace absurdity. And that to me is just nuts, frankly. Now listen to what Doolittle's reply to this would be. His reply to any point like this would be to say, well, science requires empiricism, right? The nature of science is empirical by definition. That is just what science is. And so to the extent that you're not being empirical, even hyper-empirical like he is, you are therefore not being scientific. Well, I mean, what do you say to this? Well, look, science cannot be irrational. Okay? This is just a fundamental philosophical premise of mine. And the trouble is that if you do not structure your approach to science by certain a priori rationalistic considerations, you will wind up being led willy-nilly, left and right, into contradictory nonsense. What you're saying won't make sense, and his whole attempt to derive an approach to property rights from simply examining empirically how various cultures have behaved is an example of that. See, if you actually follow the empirical data fully and faithfully, you will realize very soon that people don't behave consistently. And so the only way to give the appearance of consistency to any theory that is derived in that way is to fudge with words. It's to mess around and play linguistic tricks and try to redefine words in unconventional ways, which is exactly what he's doing. Look, I'll give you an example. You sometimes hear in anthropology that across all sorts of societies, incest is a universal taboo. Well, okay, but how do you define incest? And when you examine with a fine-tooth comb, when you perform a fine-grained analysis in different societies, you realize they all have very different approaches to incest. In some societies, it's not considered okay to have sexual relations with your cousin. That's not considered incest. In others, it is. So the question is, where do you draw the line? What counts as incest? And different societies have different answers to that question. And so if you simply restrict yourself to saying that societies universally condemn incest, you're not really saying anything, because the term incest hasn't been given precise, definite content. You're fudging on the word incest. You're not giving it a specific, precise, exact definition. And the problem is that once you say, okay, here is how closely related the relative must be to you in order for sexual relations with that relative to count as incest, and you set down that line, and you say anyone more distantly related wouldn't be, having sex with someone more distantly related wouldn't be an incestuous relationship, but doing it with someone as nearly related as where that line is or nearer would be, you realize you can't sustain claims to universality then, because different societies draw the line differently. So when you just restrict yourself to saying that incest is universally condemned, you're not saying anything. The statement has no content. And the same thing is going on with Doolittle here. When he's saying that societies universally punish theft, well, he's not defining theft, okay? And when you look at the norms of various societies, you realize many of them have different ideas about what counts as theft, and they're not consistent. These ideas are not consistent with each other. And the only way to make it appear consistent is to play with words and do like little linguistic trickery and fudge around. And that's what he does. That's what comes out. He has to then try to equate free riding with theft, even though their definitions are different. And he has to play this kind of linguistic game in order to avoid looking irrational. And he has to do that because of his empirical approach. See, empiricism, strictly followed, doesn't care for consistency because, as I said, there's nothing about empirical human behavior that requires that humans behave consistently, and so they don't. If you follow only the empirical evidence and nothing else, you're not going to get anything consistent. How can you build a theory that way? So, and yeah, as to the response that science requires that, I would insist that it does not. Science cannot be just irrational nonsense. Science, before we can begin doing it, before we can begin approaching data and phenomena empirically, has to have certain parameters set down for it by certain rationalistic a priori considerations, certain basic metaphysical notions about reality. Some of these discussions came out in the video on quantum mechanics that I did recently. And what I did is I contrasted the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics with a more realistic interpretation, like, let's say, Bohmian mechanics, for example. A GRW would be another example, although I didn't discuss that there. Now, in the Copenhagen interpretation, there is a certain mathematical formalism that describes particles which are not being observed as existing in a kind of joint superposition. And the Copenhagen interpretation takes from this mathematical model the conclusion that what this model says is actually an accurate description of reality. But that doesn't follow. Just because the math works a certain way doesn't mean that that's actually what's really going on. The only thing that a model of a scientific theory can allow you validly to deduce is that you will be able to generate accurate predictions if you follow this model. It does not follow that what's being described is actually what's going on. I gave the example of Ptolemaic astronomy. You can generate accurate astronomical predictions using the Ptolemaic model. It doesn't mean that its actual ontological claims are true, though. Right, that's sort of one of those kind of points. You need certain basic metaphysical presuppositions that are a priori, that can only be derived rationalistically, to frame your science, to give it a framework within which it can work. And without doing that first, you are at the mercy of irrational nonsense. And so, credit to Kinsella for actually saying, okay, here's a definition of theft, here's a definition of free riding, they're not the same, and so if empirically societies happen to treat theft as though it were free riding or vice versa, they're wrong. They're treating apples like they're oranges. And so in the interest of consistency and rationality, we can't do that. Doolittle is saying the opposite thing. He's essentially saying to hell with rationality. Who cares about consistency? What we see is what we see, and allegedly that's what science demands of us. I don't buy that that's what science demands of us. I don't think that science requires us to be irrational. That's really what the disagreement comes down to. I think that you need certain rationalistic a priori considerations to constrain anything that you do empirically, because science isn't coherent. Science doesn't make any sense. You can't understand scientific theories before you do that. Doolittle just wants to rush straight into empiricism. You can't do that. That doesn't work. So that's really all I have to say in response to Todd's comment. Now, he said at the end, that's really why I disagree with Doolittle. I don't buy that whole propertarian approach, that hyper-empirical approach, which just takes the commons as given, and which says that any theory which diverges from them, simply because it diverges from them, must be wrong. And it must be wrong because humans empirically care about these things. I think he's just playing with words and trying to make contradictions fit together. He's in the name of science, he's insisting on irrationality, which is really bizarre to me. And then you just combine that point with the fact that nothing in libertarian property rights theory as such requires that you not care about things like race, ethnicity, religion, culture, etc. That's it. So as far as I can see, there's no problem here. There's no issue. And if there are divides or disagreements among libertarians on this question, it doesn't necessarily follow that they'll become propertarians like Doolittle, because there's a whole bunch of epistemological baggage that goes with having to do that. And I don't buy that. I don't buy it at all. It makes science and really your entire approach to reality, uh, just kind of senseless and irrational. Um, yeah, and I insist that cannot be the case. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Okay then. Uh, right. So okay, let's just move on now. All right, next comment. Let me switch over now to allowing you to see the screen. Here. Hold on. There you go. All right, let's go to other comments here. Let's see. All right, I remember what else I have to discuss. Here we go. Where is it? Here we go. This is a comment on my review of Michel Houellebecq's novel Submission. Right here from this person, listener. I had gotten into a discussion with him about paganism and Christianity. So here goes. I'm just going to read his comment. It's a bit lengthy, as you can see, and I'll respond to it as I go. Okay. Certainly it is true that Plotinus and the other pagan philosophers are not representative of the understanding of the gods that an average everyday pagan would have had, but neither are Augustine and Thomas Aquinas representative of the average Christian. Of course they aren't, but the earlier point that I was trying to make, okay, just to give you some context here. This person tried to argue, like a lot of neo-pagans on the alt-right do, that Christianity is basically a Jewish religion, that it's fundamentally Jewish, and so it is part of this, Jewish plot to subvert and undermine European cultural solidarity and to sort of degrade Europe and the West and so on. And that Christianity is part of that because of its Jewish roots. Now, what I had pointed out in response is that Christian theology has certain views about what we are to make of the Jews. And the Orthodox position, at least among Catholics, and this has been the Orthodox position in all of Christianity until at least the Protestant Reformation, was the one that came from Augustine, which is supersessionism. And supersessionism is basically the idea that, yes, once the Jews did have a covenant with God, but that since Christ was the Messiah, a new covenant has been formed, and now that covenant is no longer restricted to just the Jews as an ethnic group, but instead goes to everyone who believes in Christ and keeps his commandments and does good works and what have you, et cetera, all the rest of the theological baggage. So I was pointing to Augustine, and I was saying that that was the Orthodox Christian position on the Jews. So how you can accuse Christianity as a whole of elevating or worshiping Jews when it has this central component to its theology that explicitly deprives Jews of their status as the chosen people just doesn't make any sense to me. So, but he goes on to say, well, you can't say that anything about what philosophers like Augustine or Aquinas thought is representative of the average Christian. They aren't representative. Yes, Thomas Aquinas had very sophisticated arguments for lots of things, and the average Christian medieval peasant probably didn't think of things in those terms. But the point is that even though someone like Augustine was a philosopher, his position specifically on the question of the Jews was orthodoxy. Okay, that's what the church accepted, and that was taught without challenge until at least the Protestant Reformation. That's the important point here. Okay, so let's continue. If the philosophers and theologians get to define Christianity, then the same holds true for paganism. Well, I'm not really saying that, but okay. For far too long, paganism has been interpreted either through the lens of Christianity or secularism, both of which distort true pagan teaching. Okay. About Plato, one wonders what he would have said about the Jewish God and the Jewish myths. Well, he didn't have much good to say about the pagan myths either. Plato was famously opposed to poetry, to any kind of metaphorical representation of really anything, because he feared that these rhetorical tools could fall into the hands of unscrupulous people, and that would be used to mislead people and generate all kinds of chaos and moral depravity and vice and what have you. So he opposed all kinds of mythological or metaphorical representations of all sorts of things, and mythology would fall into that. All kinds of sacred stories, insofar as they're to be interpreted allegorically, would fall into that. All right. So, because he would say that if you're using a story as part of your religion and you're insisting that it should be interpreted allegorically, what you're doing is that you're taking that story and you're placing it at a certain level of abstraction away from pure reality. And so you're keeping people away from pure reality. And Plato would have been against that. So I think he would have been against, all sorts of religious stories. Okay, moving on. Of course, I'm aware that the Bible can be interpreted in many ways beyond the literal. The same is true of the pagan myths. Well, yes, I suppose so, and perhaps it would be interesting to see some kind of sophisticated allegorical exegesis of things like that. Although, as I said, Plato probably wouldn't look too kindly upon that. How the Bible is interpreted is not really the main issue. Rather, why is it being interpreted in the first place? Why would a pagan accept the Bible as uniquely and exclusively the Word of God? What reason would he have to even pick up the book? Well, that's not really the question we're discussing here. I mean, no one who doesn't believe the central claims of Christianity would have a reason to do that. And I'm not really arguing that Christianity is true. I'm just sort of saying, okay, at least in this series of comments here, I was saying that, look, Christianity replaced paganism. It replaced it for a reason, and that replacement had certain cultural consequences, many of which were quite good. So the question of whether the Bible is divinely inspired or true, or whether the Christian religion is true, or all of this is not really the point. It's not really interesting for my purposes. Okay, he goes on. The same holds about the Jews. Why is the question of the Jews even being discussed at all? Well, because Christianity started as a Jewish sect. I mean, that's the truth, right? Christianity originated as a Jewish sect. But to draw the conclusion, as he then goes on to do, that because of its Jewish origins, Christianity somehow remained such for its entire history, just doesn't follow. And you can see this very clearly if you know much of anything about the early history of Christianity. When St. Paul went around preaching throughout Rome and other cities, he explicitly said that the new covenant that God has established with Christians through Christ and because of Christ meant that one no longer had to become a Jew before they could become a Christian. These things were actually debated in the very earliest Christian council. This is something like 45 AD, not long after Christ's death. The apostles, as well as Jesus' half-brother James, came together to discuss certain basic questions like, did you first have to be a Jew before you could convert to Christianity? The answer they decided was no, you didn't. You didn't have to get circumcised. You didn't have to follow Jewish dietary laws anymore. You didn't have to do any of that. And as Christians reached these conclusions, the Jews began to see them as increasingly heretical and dangerous, because here they were saying that Jewish dietary laws weren't important anymore. Various Jewish rituals like circumcision weren't needed anymore. If you're saying all of that already, to what extent are you meaningfully Jewish? Right? You're not imposing restrictions anymore that are ritualistic or dietary in character. You're not saying that conversion to Judaism is necessary anymore before conversion to Christianity. How is this still meaningfully Jewish? That's what I'm saying. All right, but let's go on here. Why are the Jews even being considered? Well, as I said, because of that origin, but because of the origin of Christianity within Judaism. It doesn't follow, though, that it remained somehow tainted by Judaism. And, okay. Why would they even entertain the idea that the Jews are or were the chosen people? Because Christianity was a sect of Judaism. That's where it started. The conclusions that you're drawing from that fact, though, don't follow. Why would they even consider worshiping a god that had rejected their ancestors? Okay, well, all right, here's the other point. The people who were subjected to the imperial authority of Rome would not have considered prior Roman pagans to be their ancestors. Okay, they wouldn't have felt any kind of solidarity or connection to them. You're projecting the ideas and the feelings and the attitudes of a contemporary white nationalist on someone living 2,000 years ago around Rome. That doesn't make any sense to do because the situation at that time was entirely different. Like Northern Africa, for example, had a much greater proportion of whites living in it than Northern Africa currently. So there was a different ethnic makeup. But also, again, you have to understand, Rome was the imperial power. And if there is an imperial power out there with its boot on your neck, you're not going to say, oh, these are my ancestors. You're not going to feel fondly for these people. You're going to resent them. You're not going to like them. So that attitude on the part, at least of non-Romans, is completely sensible. There's no reason at all for them to consider the Roman pagan gods to be the gods of their ancestors. Why should they be presumed to have any connection with the Romans? Again, people weren't thinking back then like contemporary white nationalists are. All right, the next point. And as far as the actual Romans themselves go, who wound up converting to Christianity in the early years of the religion, well, they obviously did it because the old pagan gods weren't doing it for them anymore. When you examine the history of the mystery religions in the late Roman Empire, you see a lot of really desperate, breathless spirituality. You see a tremendous amount of desperation to transcend the material realm. And that is an indication of the fact that people, frankly, were just sick of their circumstances and sick of life as it was for them. They wanted an escape. That's why you get this really ecstatic, breathless kind of spirituality in all of these cults that emerged at that time around figures like, Mithras, Isis, etc. And Christianity was one of the religions that came out of that period. But of course, why Romans themselves wound up converting is that the spiritual sustenance that the Roman pagan gods were there to give to the people who believed in them were no longer doing that anymore. The religion and the associated culture were in decline. They were no longer fit for purpose, and people moved on to something else. Again, they're not going to have the attitudes of contemporary white nationalists where they think, well, I must remain true to my ancestors at all costs. Why would they do that? They weren't being threatened by, third world immigrants invading their countries. They lived in entirely different circumstances, and so they behaved differently. All right, moving on. When the Christian canon was formed, why was it taken as a given that the Jewish non-Christian scriptures were divinely inspired, but that all pagan non-Christian writings were not? As I said, number one, Christianity began as a sect of Judaism, and Christ's coming was supposed to be the fulfillment of a prophecy originally expressed in Jewish scripture. So you had to include some of that Jewish scripture to show reference to those prophecies and therefore say, see, the prophecies were fulfilled. The point is to give the complete story. Actually, when you look at Augustine's views on the Jews and supersessionism, one of the questions that he dealt with is why, now that Christ has arrived and all of that's happened and Christianity exists, why are there still any Jews at all? And his answer was, and you can choose to accept this or not, but the point is that it's a clever answer within the context of Christianity. His answer was that the Jews existed to serve as witnesses. That if there were Jews who accepted these old Jewish prophecies about the Messiah, and if you could still find them being about today, that would prove that the claims made by Christians that Christ actually fulfilled these older prophecies weren't made up. That these prophecies really existed and that Christians weren't, forging documents or whatever. That was Augustine's justification for why there were still Jews. It was to show that Christians weren't lying about their claims that Christ was the Messiah. That's an answer that a Christian could give. And I'm not even a Christian, but I'm just saying that these questions that you're giving here, there are answers to them, and it wouldn't be immediately a priori irrational to accept those answers, at least within the context of Christianity, if you're inclined to accept it. Why were the non-pagan scriptures not divinely inspired? Well, I mean, a few crucifixions and a few feeding of your co-religionists to hungry lions might give you the idea that the people doing it might be, I don't know, bad, demonic, something like that, and that the gods inspiring them to do the things that they were doing were also evil. There are all sorts of historical circumstances that might have influenced that. This is just the kind of thing that happens when one culture passes away and another supplants it. That's what happens when cultures are in decline. All right, why is it essential that all people, not just the Jews, know about Moses? Well, again, I explained that you have to put all these old Jewish prophecies in their context so that you can understand the fulfillment that Christ supposedly represented. What is in the Jewish writings that are not in the pagan writings? Those prophecies. Okay, can you not see the double standard here? Well, maybe there is a double standard, but as one culture is transitioning to another, why is there a requirement to maintain even-handedness here? Look, the pagan religion and classical antiquity had a certain set of cultural assumptions and religious and theological claims that were at the center of its worldview. Those things informed its culture and made it what it was. And Christianity also correspondingly had its own basic assumptions, basic Weltanschauung, basic Zeitgeist, basic things that informed what it was as a culture. Now, why when society is undergoing a transition from one set of beliefs to the other, is there some abstract rule to show even-handed consideration of all things? There isn't. But even so, in many ways, there were many things about classical pagan antiquity that were absorbed into Christianity. Look at pagan philosophy. I mean, Aristotle and Plato were enormously influential. You could not have had medieval scholasticism without Aristotle. So of course the pagans left their own sort of mark on Christianity and influenced it. It's not like they were completely ignored. The rising Christian culture took parts of the old pagan culture that was passing away, that were useful to it, transformed them for its own purposes, and reabsorbed them as it could do. That's what happens during cultural transitions. Okay. All right, so moving on. The claims of the Christian theologians that the Bible has many layers of meaning is simply taken for granted, while the teachings of the pagan philosophers are casually dismissed as unusual and irrelevant to paganism as a whole. Well, look, here's the thing. When theologians in the early church, and again, this is true up to the Protestant Reformation, when theologians produced sophisticated, multi-layered interpretations of the Bible, those entered into the Catholic magisterium and church doctrine through councils. When they became doctrine, they were official pronouncements. Now, I'm not aware of any equivalent thing within the pagan world. I am not aware of anything where some myth or pagan story was given some allegorical spin, and then a cohort of pagan priests came together and authoritatively declared, okay, this is how paganism as a whole must look at this particular story. That was never done. But when the Catholic Church did things like that, it made claims for Christianity as a whole, at least, as I say, up to the point of the Protestant Reformation, where you began to see splits. So you can treat these approaches to allegory as representative of Christianity as a whole, because the church declared them to be so. The church said authoritatively that this is what the church believes. Paganism didn't have any equivalent thing to this. All right, let's see. Oh, but even worse is that if anything is to be given the benefit of the doubt, it should be the pagan myths of our ancestors, not the myths of a foreign people. Again, people living 2,000 years ago did not have the attitudes of contemporary white nationalists. You're just sort of projecting this onto them. And also, as I said, in what meaningful sense is the Christianity of today or the Christianity of 1200 Jewish? It doesn't make any sense. Once again, I refer you back to that early Christian council where they specifically said that the Christian religion does not require that new converts accept Jewish dietary laws or perform any of these other Jewish rituals. There was a definitive break with Judaism. Okay? It's not, it didn't remain some Jewish religion. And in any event, even if something that explicit didn't happen, the fact of the matter is Christianity was a molding force within Europe for close to 2,000 years. The major, all-pervading influence of everything. And if it influenced European culture to that extent and informed the lives of Europeans to that extent for that long, how could it not have gone on to take on a distinctly European hue? I mean, I ask again, what is Jewish about this? And the only argument in favor of that claim seems to be that Christianity happened to have originated as a Jewish sect. But again, in the light of history, that just doesn't mean much. Okay, he goes on to say, the Emperor Julian was given an aristocratic education as a Christian, yet he not only later converted to paganism, he became the greatest enemy the Christian church religion ever faced. How is this possible? It's very simple. He studied pagan philosophy and was initiated into the deepest mysteries of the pagan religion. He understood what paganism really was, and he knew what would be lost if the empire became Christian. Okay, I'm going to make a reference here. There's a chapter in a book written by the theologian David Bentley Hart called Atheist Delusions. Hart himself hates this title. He didn't choose it. His publisher chose it for him. But the subtitle of the book is The Christian Revolution and Its Fashionable Enemies. And that was the title Hart wanted to give the book. In any event, there's a section of one of the chapters where he discusses Julian the Apostate. And he points out a few odd things about Julian. One of them is, and I'm paraphrasing Hart here, he says that Julian was the sort of pagan that every Christian should aspire to be as a Christian. In fact, if you read through some of Julian's letters, he says that one of the reasons why Christianity is catching on so quickly is that these Christians are so charitable. They go out of their way to help others. They deliberately inconvenience themselves, give away their wealth, donate enormous amounts to helping the unfortunate, the poor, the downtrodden, etc. Pagans did not have a history of doing this. This is not a general trend within pagan society. There is no tradition to this effect in pagan antiquity. None. This originated totally with Christianity. And what Julian said is that this charitable spirit of the Christians is giving them a sort of PR advantage over pagans, and so if we pagans want to persist as a cultural force, we should be like them. We should emulate them. So it's odd, because Julian in many ways was a pagan on Christian principles, you could say. He did unwittingly incorporate a lot of this sort of Christian ethics into his particular view of paganism. There's also all this kind of weird stuff where he participated in like theurgy and these odd practices that were associated with the mystery religions of that time. He also, his particular brand of paganism really was that kind of breathlessly spiritualistic and otherworldly sort of paganism that really was common at that time. This is why in Gore Vidal's novel Julian, where he tries to portray Julian as being this kind of bon vivant, the sort of pagan that Nietzsche thought all pagans were, where they just enjoyed material reality, didn't scorn the flesh, didn't scorn life, didn't pray for any kind of otherworldly salvation, but simply made their way in this life, in the here and now. That's how he portrays Julian in that novel, but that's completely inaccurate. That's not what Julian was actually like at all. All right, now, to the point that the empire's becoming Christian would wreak cultural changes. Of course that's true. If you have a different animating narrative or animating theology, you're going to produce a different culture out of it. Yes, a pagan culture is going to look different fundamentally from a Christian one. And there are things that are going to be lost in the transition. There's no question about that. There are also things that are going to be gained. So, and we sort of have to face that question again when talking about the decline of Christianity in the West. What's going to be lost now that that's gone? Will it be certain ideas about the sanctity of life, certain moral precepts about I don't know, being charitable or being kind, or that whole thing about turning the other cheek. Now, it may to some extent be good that these things pass away because the perhaps pathological levels of altruism that we see in the West today will die down. But there will be negative consequences as well. That's what always happens with cultural transitions. When one culture dies out and another replaces it, some good things happen as a consequence and some bad things happen as a consequence. Some things are lost that you'd rather not lose, and some things are gained that is good to gain. That's the way of things. And it's an interesting question what that sort of transition will look like with respect to Christianity's passing away. So yeah. Okay, moving on. Julius Evola made the point that early Christian criticism of paganism was quite similar to Protestant criticism of Catholicism. Why is one form of criticism valid and the other not? Well, you'll have to be more specific here. Also, he stated that Christianity at its best, that is, the medieval variety, was in many ways far closer to paganism than to primitive Christianity. Really? Well, the early Christians were really against female infanticide, which the Romans practiced quite a lot. So what? Did the medieval Christians suddenly accept that? I mean, what? Christians were charitable. They set up hospitals to care for lepers. Pagans didn't. So what happened? Did medieval Christians revert from that practice and stop doing that? What are you saying? I suppose I'm not really clear on what the point is. I suppose that what you're referring to is that medieval Christianity had this very hierarchical character, and that Protestantism was more anarchic, more egalitarian, and so on. I suppose that's true, but again, you're painting with an extremely broad brush here, and unless you get down into the specifics, it's very difficult to really evaluate the claim in any way that produces any sort of meaningful conclusions. All right, so what most people find most attractive about traditional forms of Christianity is not the doctrine, but the very things that were taken from paganism. What, like female infanticide? Like the idea that fathers could legitimately sell their daughters into prostitution. This was allowed under Roman law, and it was only the Christian Emperor Theodosius that finally abolished this practice. So again, what are you referring to here? Unless you're being specific, I can't really respond, because it might be that you're making a valid point, but then again, it might be that you're just wearing rose-colored glasses when looking at the classical world. All right, moving on. While Evola did rightly criticize modern pagan movements, it is not inconceivable that pagan movements will continue to grow, strengthen, and deepen their philosophical understanding, and at some point become a legitimate alternative to Christianity. Maybe. I mean, it's not inconceivable, sure. I have no idea what that would look like, and to be honest, paganism just seems bizarre to me. It's not something that it seems like I could take seriously. All right, so he said, I studied history in college, so I understand the discipline. I also understand its flaws. Academic history does not understand the world. Okay. Sure, fine, I guess. Then he says, whatever has been gained by modern science has not been worth what is lost. Well, that's, all right, I should give context to this statement. I had made points earlier in the discussion to the effect that certain Christian theological premises were essential to the rise of science, and that without a specifically Christian outlook, such things couldn't have happened. So, for example, just to draw up an example from one of Stanley Yaki's books, he makes a very interesting point. He says that, well, there are a few things, but for one, there's the notion of the incarnation, that according to Christianity, God himself became flesh. He became physically embodied as a man, and he walked the earth, and he was both fully human and fully divine, somehow, miraculously. But by thereby making a physical, material human being become God himself, the incarnation thereby sanctified all of materiality. And that means that when science investigates the material world, it is performing a holy act. Through the incarnation, the material world was sanctified. by investigating it, you are, in a sense, doing God's work. And so there's this great impetus to scientific investigation. Classical pagan culture did not have any equivalent to this. This is why nothing like modern science was able to come out of ancient Greece or ancient Rome, despite the fact that these cultures were extremely advanced and that there were many people in them who were, frankly, brilliant. They were geniuses. And yet they weren't able to create this sort of thing. Another point, and this is something that Jaki in particular emphasizes, Stanley Jaki, Jaki, he's a Hungarian priest and philosopher and historian of science who's written many excellent books on the relationship between Christian theology and scientific revolution and scientific methodology and so forth. But one of the points he makes is that in the pagan cosmos, in the pagan vision of the cosmos, there are, I suppose you could say, spirits, minor gods, nymphs, the Furies, all these sorts of things that influence the action of things in the world, that influence events. Really, if you look at Aristotle's cosmology in particular, the cosmos comes out as this almost organic being, as if it's itself ensouled. And if it itself has a soul, then its movements and its actions will have their wellspring in that soul. If the cosmos is a living being, then its actions cannot be said to follow strictly predictable and uniform patterns. Now, Christianity didn't do anything like that. It said, no, the cosmos is just material, and that's it. From that, you get the idea that you can have repeated, predictable, definite actions, that things in the natural world will occur in patterns, they will not randomly change, and so you have the conditions whereby you can perform legitimate and reliable scientific investigations. So I made these sort of points, and they aren't utterly unique to Christianity. This is something that no other culture has created and that specifically emerged out of Christian theological premises. I think this is indisputable. But what my interlocutor here wound up doing is that he shifted the discussion and said, well, it may be that Christianity was essential to the emergence of science, but so much has been taken away. We've been, I guess, culturally drained by it. It's created this materialistic culture where no one cares about spiritual truths or any such thing, that we're all focused on the material because of the orientation that science gives us. And so the whole thing wasn't worth it. Well, whatever truth there might be in that assertion, it is frankly a dumb and autistic thing to say. I mean, you do realize that not long ago, people were dying in droves of what today are easily preventable diseases. They worked in backbreaking conditions, suffered extraordinary difficulties, ridiculous amounts of toil, and the lives of billions of people have been relieved, have been extended, because of the work of modern science. You're just going to wave your hand and pretend like that doesn't mean anything? Are you serious? That is a point of view that I cannot understand. All right, so to conclude the comment, he says, who Christ was or was not, and there's been a great deal of disagreement between Christians on this point. It has nothing to do with the Jews. Again, I explained this. I trust you know what I have to say in regard to that. The incarnation need not be among the Jews. He's just carping on the Jews here, again, but all of this was explained. If the unique incarnation of Christ is true, there's no reason that idea could not be incorporated into a pagan framework. I'm not sure about that. I mean, it would have to be significantly altered. We need not dishonor our ancestors. Okay, well, all right, that's it. That's really all I have to say with regard to that particular comment. I know that this has been taking a while, but those are the two longest comments. Everything else is going to be shorter now. Shoo. Let's move on. I should probably... All right, you know what? It's getting dark. I'm going to turn the lights on here. as soon as I transition back to you being able to see me. So if everyone could just give me a second, I'll be back in just a few seconds here. Hold on a sec. Okay. Okay, lights on. So yeah, that was me knowing things. Here's me drinking. My mouth is getting pretty dry anyway from all this talking. So, right, moving on. Let's see, what else did I have to answer? Oh yeah, I remember. There was another question on one of my theological origins videos. It's about Western imperialism. Okay. Okay, here we go. Neil Wallace, he says, "Thank you for an astonishingly erudite and informative series, which seems to get ridiculously low viewing figures." Thank you, Neil. That's very kind of you. I personally see Islam bashing as just a means for achieving social cohesion in Western countries. There's some truth to that. Although there are respects in which it is a legitimate cultural threat, particularly to Europe. It's not as serious here in the United States. But that's because we have a different situation. When I was a lad, Islam was never mentioned, as it was the Reds under the bed. The Soviet Union was the bête noire. I suspect Islam will drop off the radar with the future growth in Chinese power. Maybe, who knows. And scholars will look into the roots of Chinese history as the cause of its impudent actions. You gloss over the term blowback in Western imperialism. What are its theological causes? Hence, I must disagree with you on that point. Liberalism, yes, you're spot on there. It does seem concealed will to power and dangerous to freedom. Thanks. Okay, I didn't discuss Western imperialism because I just hadn't gotten to that point in the series yet. And I will get back to making those videos eventually. But to be really quick about it, Western imperialism really sort of got into full swing by the 19th century. We had that whole scramble for Africa and so on. And around that time, you also had intellectual movements and currents like Romanticism that were prevalent. That was a big movement in culture, in philosophy, and so forth. And I think these things are connected, because insofar as Romanticism emphasized the will, the conquering, overpowering will, it did have an influence on the self-conception of Europeans at the time, who saw themselves as, going out and civilizing backward peoples, bringing civilization to them, making things better for them, and thereby in that way expanding, growing, and just sort of conquering, as any any great race in their thinking would do. You just look at some of the poetry from that time. Kipling with The White Man's Burden, or a poem like If, which is this very inspiring triumphalist piece of poetry. See if I remember any of it. It's like I don't remember the exact words, so I don't want to make a mistake here, but it's something like, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself while all men doubt you but make allowance for their doubting too," it goes on. The point is, it's this very sort of triumphalistic poem with this message of just being able to overpower all the difficulties of life. And that ties into that whole romantic ethos. Now, the romantic ethos itself is connected to nominalism because of its emphasis on the will. Remember, the nominalistic God was pure will. And if you could really summarize the aim of Romanticism and its whole ethos in a word, it would be that it would be apotheosis. The project of making man like God. And because God was pure will, so man had to be. And as that seeped into the culture, these notions of conquest did as well, and imperialism followed. Now, the earlier stretches of imperialism from the 17th century and so on, the very earliest accounts of it, I think, also are tied into nominalism to the extent that they're tied into the rise of science, scientific rationality, and so on. But at the core was this impulse to expansion, which was ultimately propelled by this triumphalist ideology of the will expanding and breaking its bounds. So that, in a nutshell, is really the answer. But when I make future installments of my Theological Origins series, I will go into more detail on the question. But that's basically the answer. It ties into Romanticism and similar notions, and that idea of placing central importance on the will goes back and ties it all back to nominalism. So that's that. Okay, next. Let's see what else we got here. Let's see if I can remember if there are any other questions. I think that was everything as far as the basic comments go. So I'll just go into the actual questions that were left in the Q&A. And there's a lot, and some of them are pretty good. So I'll start here. Here we go. We've got, what is it? Spring in Fialta says, congrats, I find your discourses engaging, educational, and thorough. I especially like the one on how QM does improve idealism. This got me thinking about your series on the theological origins of modernity and nominalism in particular. There are other theorists who claim that modernism arose from a combination of nominalism, reductionism, and naturalism. It seems to me that scientists, in order to pursue the truth they're able to pursue, almost have to assume nominalism, reductionism, and naturalism. To do otherwise would be to limit the scope of their investigations. Some examples. 1. Nominalism. If one focuses on the wheelness of wheels, one might limit future inventions of wheels to just those applications which help to transport goods from one place to another. One might not think of integrating wheels into pulleys or creating cogs and gearboxes that adapt wheels so as to convert vertical motion to horizontal motion, etc. One might not stick a wheel in water to create a mill, as this would be a case of a wheel being moved rather than moving. 2. Reductionism. If one believes that some form of emergence is required to get from physics to chemistry, chemistry to biology, biology to psychology, psychology to consciousness, then one might stop looking for the reductive links in the chain that connect the different scientific phenomena. Science might be limited by something like an emergence of the gaps rather than a god of the gaps of intelligent design. 3. Naturalism. Assuming that some currently inexplicable phenomenon is due to the action of angels or the mysterious workings of God is a non-starter for science. So basically, it may very well be the case that nominalism, reductionism, and naturalism are false. However, it might be the case that unless these philosophical positions are decisively disproved, that they're useful assumptions for scientists to make. It may very well be that these are the tragic flaws modern society must bear. They allow us to progress technologically while ultimately undermining the justifications for technological progress, i.e. reducing humans to meaningless agglomerations of atoms whose technological innovations are equally meaningless and without justification. Your thoughts? Well, in short, I agree with you. You've stumbled on something important, and I think you're basically correct. There is an intimate link between nominalism and the rise of science, not just in the sense that nominalism engendered a movement away from really abstract thinking about universals, but also because of nominalism's focus on language. And that focus on language ties in, of course, to mathematics. Nominalism, of course, says that all ascriptions of properties and universals to things are just words. They're just signs. They're sort of empty linguistic tokens. So there's this focus on language within nominalism. That focus naturally pushes you toward mathematics and pushes you toward the idea that perhaps reality may be mathematically describable. So the integration of mathematics into scientific theories is intimately tied in with nominalism. Now, on the other hand, if you push nominalism too strongly, you can't have science at all, because nominalism ultimately removes all justification for any belief in any kind of law within the universe. If there are no universals at all, and if God really is this sort of being of pure, unlimited, infinite will, then anything which appears to be a law of nature can easily and immediately be undone by God, and so it isn't really a law. So you can't make the assumption that there are any kind of regular patterns in nature, because God's will is ultimately everything. If you can't make the assumption that there are such patterns, well, then you can't do science. So there is some tincture of nominalism that is required to make science workable, for the reason that you gave about thinking too much about the wheelness of wheels and so forth, but also for this linguistic aspect. But then, as I said, if you push it too far, science is eliminated entirely. About reductionism, well, I don't think there's anything about realism that precludes reductionism. Remember, if you accept Aristotelian realism, for instance, you will then have a tendency to explain the behaviors of objects in the universe, of things, in terms of their dispositional properties. So you'll say things like, if this object is in such and such a situation, under such and such conditions, it will behave in such and such a way because it is in its nature to do so. But as you change the conditions, as you change the structural conditions and the environmental conditions, you can then change the dispositions, or you can change the behaviors that emerge as a result of the dispositions. So I think emergence is allowed, but so emergence is allowed within the framework of realism. The thing is, though, if you try and pursue reductionism to psychology, you wind up assuming psychology away. You see this in eliminative materialism in the philosophy of mind, which really says that, ultimately there are no such things as beliefs. So eliminativists believe that they have no beliefs. They wind up assuming consciousness away. So there are perils to reductionism. You wind up destroying the things that you originally started out wanting to explain. And now there is some value to reductionism as long as you're dealing with inanimate matter. But if you go, full nominalism in terms of your approach to science, you lose sight of where that line is, and so you easily cross it. Regarding your third point about naturalism, scholastic realism allows for naturalism. It's just a different sort of naturalism. Thomas Aquinas insisted on naturalistic explanations, and original classical theology really did not want to have anything to do with this idea of a God who randomly and mysteriously intervened in the order of nature. What Aquinas and people like him said is that, look, God acted once to create the world, and his act is this one long continuous act of conservation that goes on for as long as the universe exists. But as far as discrete, particular, specific interventions into the order of nature, like people who believe in intelligent design would advocate, Aquinas wanted to have nothing to do with that. He insisted that that would just be bad theology, and that it would make God look bad, because the necessity of such specific interventions, barring certain exceptional circumstances like the incarnation of Christ and so on. But in terms of just the regular operations of nature, if God needed to specifically and discreetly intervene at any time, it would mean that nature was incomplete, that the construction didn't work, and that would bring disrepute upon God, I guess. So naturalism really isn't precluded. Naturalism as such isn't precluded by realism. But the kind of naturalism that arises out of nominalism is a very specific sort of naturalism. It's this very inert, purposeless kind of dead naturalism where nothing happens for a reason, where there is no teleology, and where matter is just inert and sort of just does things for ultimately no rhyme or reason. It just follows its regular patterns, and that's it. It just sort of does that. There's a very restricted range of the sorts of causality that are acceptable. So you can't have final causality. You can't have causality in terms of goals and purposes or any such thing. That can't exist. This is another reason why taking the physicalistic, reductionalistic, nominalistic paradigm to psychology ultimately winds up forcing you to say that minds don't exist, and so you wind up destroying man, really. But your basic point about having to assume bits of nominalism or aspects of it just to be able to get science started, I think, is sound. You're basically correct about that. Yeah. Okay. So, moving on to the next question. Expaladoc. Hi, Expaladoc. He says, any science fiction book recommendations? Should I read Dune? What are your thoughts on indefinite life extension? I've watched your channel from the day it was announced. Thank you for that, Expaladoc. I really appreciate that. You've actually invited me onto your show once, so just a thank you for that. So just thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around. Really nice of you. As far as science fiction book recommendations, sorry, I really can't tell you much because I honestly don't read much science fiction myself. So it's not an area that I'm familiar with, and there isn't much I can say about it. Sorry about that. Should you read Dune? I don't know. I haven't even watched Dune, David Lynch's version of it, so I don't know what to say on that. Thoughts on indefinite life extension? Well, I guess in one sense it's interesting, but in another really perilous. Think about it. There's a certain sense in which, for things to get better, certain people have to die. They have to die off. Okay, let's say you have a dictator, and he's got a hold on power and he lives forever. Well, that's pretty bad. I think him dying, even if it's just of old age, might be a good thing. It might expose, a moment in which his whole regime could be overthrown, just to give an example. Or let's say you have a group of scientists who are fixated on some particular scientific paradigm and don't want to give it up. Well, then the young guys who come along, who want to challenge those assumptions, it's going to be harder for them because, without indefinite life extension, you could, if nothing else, wait around for these people to die off and then step in and inaugurate your paradigm shift. Well, you're not going to be able to do that under those circumstances. So, who doesn't want to, keep living? Life is good, obviously. There's that obvious appeal to it. But, there are things about transhumanism that do strike me as odd. I think that there is a point at which, dying might be a good thing. If not for you individually, then at least for, the society as a whole. I guess those are sort of my basic comments on that, because a certain amount of death and rebirth is needed, and if you're not going to have death as part of that process, you're going to have a lot of crap building up, basically. That's really all I have to say about that. By the way, I realize that the chat is going, and I've kind of been largely ignoring the chat. So I have no idea what's going on there, and really haven't wanted to look at it because I'm going through various questions, and I know probably a lot of you have asked a ton of questions, so sorry for ignoring that. It's just that I'm going through the questions that I have to go through now. So let's go on here. Okay, STH says, you might add some commentary on the arts and broader culture today, huh? Okay, well, modern art sucks. And it sucks because, well, in part because it's driven almost entirely now by identity politics. There's no concern given to producing good art, to displaying technical skill, or any of these things. And so any old piece of shit that someone arbitrarily decides to declare art can now be classified as art, provided that the artist, quote unquote artist, has the right ideological affiliation. And that's obviously a corruption of art, because art is meant to do a lot of things, to elevate you, to get you to, aim for something higher, to transcend ordinary limitations on experience, I suppose, to really kind of go beyond the mundane and really reach for the very greatest that we're capable of as humans, or as anything. And the ultimate orientation of art, if you want to look at it classically, is God, because it's the highest thing you can aim for. The architects of medieval cathedrals would create these very elaborate and intricate designs, these spandrels on cathedrals. They would put them into places where they knew that no one passing by would be able to see them. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, liked to tell this story, by the way. And so many of these builders would be asked, well, if no one is going to see these intricate, beautiful designs that you're making, why are you putting them there? And they say, well, because God will see them. So the idea here is, it doesn't matter if you get attention for it. It doesn't matter if you're recognized, at least not in this life. The point is, you should always just strive to do the absolute best work that you can do. And that's something that you saw in older approaches to art. And now it's just narcissism. Right? Now it's just any old shit that I produce, even if it's literally a piece of shit. And I mean that. Counts as art. Rather sad. Really, really sad. Horrible. And it says a lot about the state of our culture. By the way, someone who you may be interested in looking up, and he's got a few videos of his lectures here on YouTube, is Richard Taruskin. He's a musicologist and historian of music, and he's written what looks like an absolutely amazing 5-volume history of Western music that I have to read one day. And he's odd in terms of art critics, in that I wouldn't call him conservative exactly, but compared to just about everyone else, he looks conservative. And so, of course, the establishment that he works in calls him a Nazi and so on. And the only reason that his career hasn't been destroyed is that he's legitimately an excellent and well-respected scholar of music. And if you look through some of the lectures of his that are up on YouTube, he discusses things like the fact that classical music in the West, especially in the last 50 or 60 years, has really kind of lost touch with its audience, and that the musicians really just they don't care about actually creating anything good anymore. What they seem to, nothing, they don't care about creating anything that actually gives enjoyment, which, shouldn't be a crazy idea that that's one of the things that art should do. So you have these bizarre compositions like John Cage, I think it's called 432, where it's literally just no sound at all. It's just quiet. And, it's said, oh, yes, the artistic purpose of this is to examine what sounds are like. There's this very kind of douchey approach to it all. Comes out of the art criticism surrounding things like that piece, if you want to call it that, by John Cage. So the idea is, well, we're gonna look at sound, and all sound, and it's really profound. Bullshit. It's not profound. It's bullshit. It's a guy who's too lazy to make actual music, calling it music by making some sort of pretentious pseudo-artistic statement. But the thing that Taruskin points to, and I don't want to start rambling here, so I'll get to the point of why I brought him up. The thing that he points to is that there seems to be this idea in art criticism now that the intentions and the motivations and the vision of the artist can never be questioned. Okay? The artist's vision is its own justification. So there can never be anything like a legitimate moral criticism of art. So I don't know, let's say you write a play that glorifies terrorism. Well, you may never be criticized on moral grounds for doing that. Or let's say you just, create a story or create any work of art that in any way glorifies or attempts to portray in a sympathetic light anything that would be considered immoral behavior. It's not considered legitimate to criticize the work of art on that basis anymore. The idea has become pervasive that artists no longer have any social responsibility of any kind. And if you dare to suggest that they might, well, they'll just say, "Oh, it's just art. It's just me producing, the free artistic creations of my own will or whatever." Well, I mean, here's the odd thing. If this is really true, that all of these artists who are producing this stale, boring, modern art really are responding to the calls of their inner souls, right? Why are they all producing the same crap? Like, you'd expect some differentiation, wouldn't you? Isn't it odd that these people claiming to be responding to the inner pullings of their own artistic spirit, are all doing the same thing, essentially. And they're afraid to dissent from that pattern. It's completely senseless, right? Come on, make sense of that, right? You're all supposedly free and autonomous creators, and you're super original. And yet, like lemmings, you all subscribe to this idea that the artist's intentions are above criticism, that artists as such have no moral responsibilities, and that the artist's vision is never to be questioned. You may never say, okay, he had a bad vision. Yes, I understand what he desired to do, but he was wrong to desire this. You may not say that. And Taruskin gives all kinds of examples of this kind of thing. They could be, plays that glorify Palestinian terrorists. He gives an example of that. Or, something even like, God, what am I thinking? I'm thinking of, here we go. Byron's poem Manfred, where the main character does all these horrible things. And you see this in a lot of romantic literature. You have these kind of anti-hero characters who do terrible things, but are nevertheless portrayed sympathetically because they're creatures of will. Like Goethe's Faust, for example. He does horrible things. I mean, he just to give, a small example, he drives the woman that loves him supposedly to suicide and does an enormous list of terrible things. And yet at the end, he's redeemed in this bizarre Deus Ex Machina-like moment because of his striving. Oh yes, he was striving for new experiences. He had that ever-conquering will, which is, again, a big component of Romanticism. And that supposedly redeemed him, just because he was, true to his vision and authentic. These are the sort of buzzwords that you hear in art circles now. And it's become a pretentious circle jerk, because that's all anyone really cares about. It doesn't occur to them that they might have different responsibilities or different things to aim for. So art's lost sight of that. It's become pretentious. And so it's necessarily in decline, and Taruskin, of course, focuses on music specifically, but you can see this in other areas. So, and that ties into nominalism too, because it's this whole idea of the will here, right? So, yeah, it's just this notion of the all-conquering infinite will poisoning everything, as it's wont to do. Because the idea that the artist may have to answer to anything higher than himself is considered blasphemous. So these supposedly free-spirited people don't allow themselves to ask that question. I mean, it should be asked why that's going on, because that is odd. Now, I'm not saying that you should necessarily restrict all art to only promoting right or good things, because there are problems with imposing restrictions on artists that are too severe. I understand that. You can see that in the socialist realism of the Soviet Union, where every piece of art had to be a propaganda piece, and that became boring, and you can see how it would become boring and stifling and horrible. But there's another extreme to this as well. Um, so, someone maybe from the Soviet Union would criticize the free sort of romantic approach to art that one sees in the West and say that, well, what you consider to be the free expression of your own artistic impulses is really just narcissism and navel gazing. And the opposite response to the proponent of, let's say, socialist realism would be, well, what you say is really just your high-minded moral responsibility to your society, is really just your own kind of stifled fuddy-duddy nature, and you're so conservative that you're not allowing yourself to think or to break any taboos or anything like that. And both of those sides of the coin are valid. The problem is, in the West, we've moved too far to one side, to that navel-gazing, narcissistic side. And so that's all that art seems to be anymore, at least the so-called high culture. It's all just narcissism. And it's meaningless. It's empty. And most people who have not been, brainwashed by these sophisticates in art circles, who want to pretend to their friends like they see profundity when there really isn't any, to normal people who've retained their common sense, it's clear that this kind of modern art just doesn't inspire anything. It's just bland. That's all I'd really have to say about that. Okay, next. Gamba God says, congrats on 500 plus subs. I have a feeling your Q&A video will break 10 plus hours. Christ, I hope not, but you may be right. Okay, next. Max Rosenfors. He says, congratulations. You have intriguing commentary and a fantastic voice with good tempo, variation, and sound. These would be my prime reasons as to why I'm subscribed. The new microphone turned this video into a minor ASMR experience even. Jesus Christ. Well, that wasn't my aim. I wasn't shooting for that. Whoops. Sorry about that. Okay, so question. Do you have any plans to talk about more hot topics, in my opinion, of debate, such as race realism, World War II, Nazism, globalism is a conspiracy? I should add that refraining from approaching these subjects might be an all-right decision, as I certainly enjoy your opinions on more well-mannered topics just as well. Okay, well, here's the thing to say about that. I haven't been shying away from those topics because I'm afraid of controversy. It's not that I'm afraid to reveal my opinions on something. I'm perfectly willing to do that. It's just that there are thousands of channels and millions of videos where you can go to see all of these quote-unquote hot topics discussed. Okay? There are plenty of people making videos about why SJWs are bad. There are plenty of videos about why globalism is bad. Plenty of videos about all of these things, about white nationalism, about these kind of more typical and standard approaches to the alt-right. And I want to do something different. I want to put something on my channel that you're probably not going to see anywhere else. I want to do something that other people aren't doing. That's really the reason for it. It's not any kind of fear of expressing my true opinion on topics. Although it might be a good idea to maybe occasionally make some videos on these subjects just so that people can know where I stand on them. That might be something that I'll do. But just to go through the three things that you suggested briefly. Race realism. Well, the thing to say on that really is I agree with it. Yes, there are innate differences between racial groups, or innate differences in mean characteristics between racial groups, I should say, and that those differences are the result of heredity, that those differences came about because of different evolutionary and selective pressures that the different racial groups were exposed to in their evolutionary histories, and all the rest of that. So, black average IQ 85, white average 100, Asian average about 103, 104, depending on where you look, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I agree with all of that. Rushton's genetic similarity theory, all the rest of that. I actually have Rushton's race, evolution, and behavior sitting on a shelf right in front of me. I'm not going to get up and get it right now because it would sort of break the flow of things. But I am familiar with race realism, and just as a scientific claim, I agree with it. I mean, the evidence for it is huge, so I'm not going to dispute that. But I mean, there are plenty of places where you can go to get all sorts of information on the subject. A long time ago, a YouTube user named Fringe Elements, although he doesn't call himself Fringe Elements anymore. He's one of the members of the channel called The Alternative Hypothesis. But way, way back, when Ryan Falk referred to himself as Fringe Elements and was sort of still an ANCAP, but I guess by this time moving away from that, he had made a video called Make the World Flat. And there's another channel that's mirrored it. And it's a 3.5 hour long video about race realism, and it covers everything under the sun that you'd care to know about that. So there are already YouTube videos on this topic. I'm not against making them, it's just that other people have done it. Okay, Nazism in World War II. Well, I did have a video about Hitler and how the press at the time, the American press that is, believed that the Nazis were actually ultimately responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I have that video, and I discussed that, and discussed in connection with that a very interesting book on the topic called Hitler Attacks Pearl Harbor by Richard Hill. And he talks about all sorts of things that have sort of fallen down the memory hole of history. So, for example, just the fact that if you read the press in the immediate aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, there are people speculating and claiming that it was actually the Germans who were behind the attack. There are all sorts of reports saying that witnesses to the attack saw German Messerschmitts there. That and even as it started to become clear that it was the Japanese who attacked, nevertheless, there were members of the press insisting that although the Japanese may have carried out the attack, it was the Germans that had put them up to it, and that Hitler was the ultimate mastermind behind the whole thing. Another very interesting point that Hill goes over in his book is he points out that Hitler actually never formally declared war on the United States. It's said that he did it on December 10th. What was it? Yeah, it was said that he did it in December 10th. Following the Pearl Harbor attack and so on of that year. But he never actually did. And if you examine the speech that he gave on that day, what he does is he goes over certain facts on the ground in relation to what the diplomatic state of affairs is between the United States and Germany. And he says that a de facto state of hostility exists because the United States has been egging on the Germans, trying to bait them into attacking the United States so that Roosevelt could then use that as a pretext for war. Hitler never took the bait, but the Japanese did because of the oil embargo that Roosevelt placed upon them. But Hitler was careful not to be baited, even though there were American submarines, for example, deliberately sent into German waters in the midst of the war, trying to be provocative. Hitler knew what was going on and didn't take the bait because he didn't want the United States to get involved in the war. I go over some of that in that video that I mentioned, and the video is called, I believe, Hitler, Pearl Harbor, Political Parasites, and Journalistic Whores. So if you're interested in that, watch that. As far as Hitler's foreign policy goes, Some people, well, many people at this point have remarked that in fact Hitler really went out of his way to seek peace with the British Empire, that he did not want war with Britain, and that the only country he truly desired war with was the Soviet Union. Churchill, however, was intransigent. In fact, he was the one who was the first to order bombings of civilian targets. I believe this was on May 10th, 1940. And Hitler pleaded with Churchill to stop doing that for quite a while, for about 6 months, and he only finally retaliated in November. When you the foreign policy aims of the Germans, in many respects, weren't so bad, at least in the lead up to the war. For example, when the Germans annexed the Saarland, the Anschluss with Austria, the Sudetenland, the Germans in the Memmelland, the Germans in Danzig, all of this, in all of these cases of annexation, you always had Hitler insisting on a referendum, a referendum about reunification with the Reich, and the referendum overwhelmingly turned out in favor of reunification. That happened, and it started out in that rather reasonable way, particularly in Danzig. And in the Sudetenland, Germans were a minority there. There were reports that they were suffering persecution, and Hitler was being called upon to do something. All these sorts of things. And then as you actually get the actual lead up to the war itself, you have the Poles being provocative in various ways. And the reason that they were is that they had received implicit declarations of support from the British and the French, that in the event of war with Germany, England and France would back Poland. And that's, of course, what happened. I mean, there's a case to be made that the British were actually trying to orchestrate this thing, that they were trying to work up the Poles to be as provocative as possible, to sort of bait the Germans into attacking and to start a clusterfuck. And yeah, that's what happened. There's a really long, really comprehensive book on the outbreak of the Second World War, and it's written by a now retired German general, Gerd Schütze-Ronhoff. He actually appeared at Hans Hermann Hoppe's meeting of his Property and Freedom Society at one point, and he wrote an enormous book on the origins of the Second World War called 1939, The War That Had Many Fathers. And he goes over all of these things in enormous detail. The European theater, everything, every last bit of diplomatic history that you can imagine. I mean, even the whole mess with the Austrian Anschluss. I'm trying to remember the name of the chancellor. I think it was Kurt Schuschnigg. He had done all sorts of really odd things to try and stymie the referendum, to get in the way of a legitimate vote being conducted. All sorts of things. So at least on the foreign policy front, in the years leading up to the war, Hitler didn't really do much that was terrible. I mean, certainly compared to the British, he behaved reasonably. And he even during the war, he made numerous proposals to the British Empire to cease hostilities, and even offered at one point the defense of British colonies should they ever come under attack by Germany's own military forces. He offered to protect the British Empire if it should be attacked, in exchange for the ceasing of hostilities. So yeah, so on the foreign policy front, you could do a lot worse than him. On the economic front, well, this is where I really kind of do have to bring down the hammer on Hitler here, because his economic programs were terrible. They were terrible. There's a lot of mythology surrounding the claim that supposedly he had revivified the German economy, and it's almost all bullshit. You see, what had happened is that Hitler had kicked off these enormous public works programs in Germany in the lead up to the war, And in doing so, he had inflated an enormous number of bubbles. And it was his luck that those bubbles had yet to pop by the time that war broke out. Now, if war hadn't broken out, you would have had enormous crashes of the German economy because of all the malinvestment and nonsense that he had promoted. I mean, especially Hermann Goering, who was just a useless imbecile with his economic planning. There was an account written by, I believe, an Australian economist named Stephen Roberts. He wrote a book published in 1936 called The House That Hitler Built. And he had actually lived in Hitler's Germany for a number of years to be able to examine economic affairs there firsthand. And by 1936, he had realized that things were starting to get bad. And so he decided that it was best that he just leave the country and write his account somewhere else, which is what he did. And he predicts in the book, and again, this book was published in 1936, that war would eventually break out. And that one of the reasons for the eventual breakout of war would be the German need for additional resources. And the Germans would need additional resources because of the utterly inept nature of Hitler's economic policies, which were actually hurting the country. In fact, at one point in 1935, things had gotten so bad that many areas of Germany were essentially on the brink of starvation. There were food riots threatening to break out. And Hitler knew that if he didn't do something quickly to restore his popularity, the German populace would turn on him swiftly and essentially, go for his head. And so he, began his annexations. He, went in the Saarland, the Sudetenland. That's when all of that began. And Roberts claimed that these decisions were politically motivated, that here Hitler could be seen to be doing all this sort of grand imperialistic stuff. He'd look cool to the domestic populace, and his approval ratings would rise. And this is true for any leader. If he starts a war or he starts some military measure whenever his support seems to be lagging, doing that helps it along. Let's see, what else? What else is there to say? Oh, well, there were all sorts of idiotic things imposed in Germany by Hitler economically. He insisted, for instance, on autarky. He insisted that the Germans produce everything domestically. Well, consequence of that is that all sorts of goods became A, more scarce than they were before, and B, more expensive than they were before, essentially driving down the standard of living of Germans. And as the price of various goods began to increase, and this was exacerbated further by the money creation that Hitler's regime engaged in, Hitler was forced to enact price controls on various goods. And the odd thing is that the price controlled prices were recorded within the economic statistics of the Third Reich. And so anyone who consults the official statistics will see those prices. And so we'll say, well, what do you mean there was inflation? There was no inflation. Well, that's not where you should look. You shouldn't look at the official statistics. You should look at the black market prices for various foodstuffs, which were exploding at the time. And this is why I say you eventually had, near famines break out. Germany was, by 1935, on the brink of starvation because of Hitler's stupid policies. And meanwhile, all he could think to do was, enact, various price-controlled measures or further clamp down on the economy. Another excellent book that really goes through a lot of Hitler's economic program is called The Vampire Economy by Gunther Reimann. And this book focused specifically on the business regulations imposed by Hitler's regime and how difficult it came to be to do business in Germany under Nazism. Companies had to set up all sorts of special bureaus just to, be able to deal with all the dictates and commands from all sorts of government agencies. And there was tremendous overhead for these things, and it made it enormously difficult to conduct business, enormously onerous, which of course, drove down productivity and so forth. But but as I said, the initial burst of German economic activity that you see in the statistics after Hitler begins his grand programs is really just a bubble being inflated. Another book on this subject that I've heard is very good, but which I have not read, is called The Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze. And I believe Length Unithar has made videos where he goes over that book in some detail. But yeah, essentially Hitler's economic program was almost indistinguishable from Stalinism. He had extremely left-wing economic views that required an enormous amount of control of the economy by the state. So enormous that Italian fascism, under Mussolini, for example, it did not reach anywhere close to the levels of control that Hitler had imposed on the German economy. And yeah, it had its consequences, but the reason that those consequences were not felt in full is that the war broke out when it did. Although even with the breakout of the war, and even with that disruption in the statistics, it didn't change the fact that economic life was extremely poor in Germany. In fact, it was so bad that soldiers in the Wehrmacht were ordered to steal valuables in all of the places that they invaded and essentially send them back home. And so, you had Germans who would get, stolen, fancy furniture that was stolen from, places in Poland or Russia or what have you. They would actually, plunder goods and send them back home. And it got to the point where that was necessary. You needed that sort of additional subsidy because that's how bad things were in Germany. Again, I don't have specific data that I can recall. Maybe if I make a more comprehensive video on this one day, I'll be able to do that. But Hitler's economic program is something I'm extremely critical of. As for globalism, yeah, I'm against it. I mean, the whole create a world government thing is bad. If you're gonna have governments at all, they should control the smallest amount of territory possible, because that way they can do the least amount of damage. And a global government is one that you cannot run from. At least if there's a national government that's doing terrible things, if things get bad enough, you can pack up and move to another country. But if you have some sort of coordinated governmental system that encompasses the entire globe, well, you can't escape this. So I'm against it. Globalism is a conspiracy. Conspiracy by whom, I ask? May it be that there are some echoes here? Is that what you're pushing for, Max? Is that what you're insinuating? Well, yeah. I mean, whoever's responsible for globalism, whether it's Soros and some small secretive sect of elitist masterminds, whoever they are, the point is I'm against it, and I don't find the idea of there being people in positions of power wanting to push for something like a global government to be absurd or not worthy of being taken seriously. Of course, I think it's worthy of being taken seriously because the state always is a locus of power. And those who are able to take control of the state apparatus can thereby plunder a tremendous amount of wealth and bring to themselves an enormous amount of power. And so if you can manufacture a state which has global control, global power, well, that just increases the amount of power that you can get for yourself as a member of that exclusive elite clique. I mean, that's really all I'll say about that. I mean, so when Alex Jones rants about globalist conspiracies, yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of truth to what he's saying. Certain specific details might be off, but the general story is one that I'm inclined to agree with. Okay, let's see. More questions. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, David Brooks. All right. He's got a list of questions here. Let's go through them. Okay, this is a corny cliche question. Which person from history would you invite over for dinner? I don't know. That's tough. I don't know if I can just narrow it down to one person. All right, I'll tell you what. I'll go through your other questions first, and in the meantime, I'll think about it and get back to that one last. Okay, so who is the worst U.S. president of all time? Okay, well, I can give you my three worst: Lincoln, FDR, and LBJ Johnson. They're horrible because they all presided over enormous expansions in state power. I'm tempted to say that FDR was the worst of all because he essentially lied the country into the war. He created the blueprint for the administrative state with his New Deal programs. And Johnson continued that with the civil rights legislation and the Great Society and all these other programs until now you have this massive administrative bureaucracy which pushes its tentacles essentially into every aspect of American life, which controls how you may conduct your businesses, how really you do almost anything. So if some, I don't know, black, lesbian, transgendered, otherkin midget walks into your store and randomly decides that they feel aggrieved, well, that person can then bring down the force of the federal bureaucracy upon your company and destroy you. And prior to the administrative state really, or the state generally, having that sort of discretionary power, that couldn't be done. Society was a lot freer, businesses much more autonomous, and FDR with his New Deal programs really did a tremendous amount to destroy that. Johnson, of course, continued it and made it worse. And we have this whole affirmative action Gestapo that's there because of him. But really, it couldn't have gotten started without FDR. And then, as I mentioned, World War II, the most destructive war in history, millions dead, horrific amounts of devastation that are indescribable, and American involvement in it started because he baited the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor and then lied and said that the attack was an utter surprise. So he's extremely Machiavellian, and one can see from, just his personal manner and things that he's written to people in his circle, that what he cared about more than anything was being a great president. It didn't matter to him whether things objectively improved in the country that he presided over. What he wanted to do was to be remembered as a great president, and sadly he was successful in being able to do that, because one of the ways in which you may be remembered as a great president is to start a huge war. Lincoln's another example of that. Many people will go and point to Lincoln as really the source of when things truly and irreversibly began to go downhill for the American Republic. I tend to put the point a little bit earlier. I think it's when the Constitution was ratified. When they threw away the Articles of Confederation, it was all downhill from there. But anyway, about Lincoln, well, there are new estimates coming out, recent estimates about the death toll of the Civil War, and they're saying something like it's 800,000 now. And of course, that war destroyed the original conception of the American Union, because originally the American federal government was meant to be composed of a collection of states united together in amity, in kind of personal and cultural ties, but it was ultimately a voluntary union, and that it was the individual states which were ultimately sovereign, so that if any of the states at any time for any reason happened to want to withdraw from that union, it could do so. Secession, at least in the original understanding of the American Compact, was allowed. It was considered acceptable. But Lincoln's war on the Confederacy destroyed that forever and kind of sealed the end of that in blood. And because the idea that one could secede politically from a political organization that one did not like or did not approve of, because that idea was destroyed in the fires of the Civil War, there's a very strong argument to be made that it started the whole process of saying that the state is essentially omnipotent, that it is to grow in power and slowly take over more and more and more and more aspects of life. And it is not legitimate to protest against this, and certainly not legitimate to protest against it to the extent of actually wanting to say that you want to break off from this union, that it does not serve you to be a member of it, that you want to form your own state, that you want to secede because you think that the taxes from Washington are too onerous or the regulations too terrible. That freedom was gone, was destroyed in the Civil War. So perhaps in terms of overall historical consequences, you could make the argument that Lincoln was worse. But I mean, even after the Civil War, it really seems like with the New Deal and the Second World War and the global American hegemony that basically emerged out of that post-1945 world order that then started the American Empire and all of that, that seems like really just much worse overall. So you can make a strong argument either for Lincoln or for FDR, but I'm just going to go for FDR because I think he was a lying, smarmy prick, and I just don't like him. So yeah, I guess that's my answer to that. What's your favorite movie of all time? God, that's another hard question. Do I have to just give one? I mean, I can give you a list of a few movies that I like. I like westerns, especially Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. I like all of those. Let's see. From then on, I could just point to sort of individual movies that I've seen that I think are excellent. Drive is a great movie. I mean, Nicholas Winding Refn in general is just a really interesting director. I mean, some of his movies are not for everybody, but Drive is probably the most accessible of them. Great movie, excellent cinematography, really fun to watch, just awesome. What else? Kind of drawing a blank here, but yeah, I mean, it's just hard to narrow it down to one. Let's see. A good movie that I watched a while ago. It's called 1114, and it's a series of different stories that happen to different of what's going on to different people living in the same area at one particular night, and the way that those stories all intersect with each other. I thought it was done in an extremely clever and interesting way. It's called 1114, like the time 1114, because the whole thing started at 1114. What else? A really good movie that I watched a while ago also. Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love. It's about a man and a woman in, I think, early 1960s Hong Kong, and they're neighbors, and they find out that their spouses are each cheating on them with each other. So basically the rest of the movie is them trying to act out what it is that their spouses must be doing together, and in a weird sort of way, it's kind of their way of coping with what's happening to them. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a single favorite movie. I can go through some movies that I like, but it would just, take a really, really long fucking time. And yeah, I mean, I can't give you a single one, unfortunately. Maybe at some point I'll come up with a list when I have a mind to do so. Favorite HBO TV show? Okay. Probably True Detective. I really loved that show, especially the first season. Although the second season was excellent too, it just really underappreciated. Yeah, I mean, I thought, Rust's character was really interesting and compelling, and even all the pessimistic rants that he went on were great. Um, and just the sort of character that he was, because here he was, this ultra cynical, pessimistic sort of guy that basically believed that deep down at bottom everyone was a piece of shit. And yet, when you look at him and what he's like and how committed he was to solving the murder case that he and his partner Marty were trying to solve. He's an honorable man. Uh, Also, by the end, there are all these kind of weird spiritualistic references. Yeah, just Rust is a really cool character. So I love the first season of True Detective. The second season really isn't for everybody, and it features a completely different story. But it is worth watching anyway, I think. It's much slower paced, and so, different in that respect. But, uh, but yeah, definitely worth checking out. I love True Detective. Deadwood is also a really good show. There's a lot of cursing in Deadwood, which makes it really fun to watch. But yeah, probably if I had to give you one, it would be True Detective, my favorite HBO TV show. Yeah, just all the themes like nihilism and all this kind of stuff. Even Marty's like all of his problems, like with the women in his life. Various aspects of that show that are excellent, and that really each would probably deserve a video in themselves. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. What country would you like to visit and why? Uh, I'd like to go to Europe while while it's still Europe. Um, just to be able to sort of see it and kind of see those landmarks myself and kind of explore the place. So there's no particular country that I'd like to go to. I mean, maybe if I had to choose one, it'd probably be Italy, just so that I could see all the churches, you know, all the whole area around Rome, the Colosseum, all of that. Just for the landmarks. But it would sort of seem incomplete if I didn't go to other areas of Europe as well. The cathedral at Chartres in France, even Cologne Cathedral, which is beautiful. Um, yeah, so I'd like to go all over Europe, ideally. Um, yeah, I guess that's the answer to that. Do you see the U.S. becoming more libertarian or less libertarian in the next 100 years? Well, so much can happen in 100 years. It's difficult to project out that far. Uh, Certainly, though, right now, the United States is facing a series of problems that really portend increasing fracturing, increasing dissolution, because more and more you're getting a clear image that the United States is being split up into two distinct antagonistic cultures, broadly speaking. There are those that are sort of uh, in favor of middle America, are at least implicitly pro white, are at least culturally right wing. They've congealed around Trump. Those sorts of people on the one hand, and then you have the left, which is in favor of identity politics. They're SJWs. They're in favor of non-white immigration. And as that non-white immigration increases, you're going to be seeing ethnic conflicts and fracturing along those lines. So there's just it's just getting to the point where American society is clearly fracturing, and I don't see how America can remain a single nation for very much longer, because there's just increasingly less and less basis for that. And after that falls apart, and I believe it will, there probably is a pretty decent chance for something libertarian-esque devolving out of at least parts of that, because there are going to be opportunities for secession that will present themselves. And when those opportunities present themselves, awesome. So it may be. I think really whether the U.S. becomes more or less libertarian in the next century really depends probably on what happens in the next 100 years. If immigration isn't stopped, if the whole If the left continues to grow in power, or at least isn't removed from power, if the United States really gets on the point where it comes to resemble, say, Brazil in terms of its racial demographics, yeah, we're probably screwed. Or at least we're screwed without serious conflict or serious warfare happening. But it's difficult to say what'll happen within those 20 years because this is a tumultuous transitional period. We're seeing a lot of paradigm shifts going on with these nationalistic revolts against globalism. The French election today, the last I heard of the polls, Le Pen placed second, although I haven't been following them since starting the stream, obviously. But yeah, Le Pen will go on to the second round. That'll be on May 7th, and we'll see what happens there. Although people are saying that Macron will probably win. Oh well. I mean, maybe it'll turn out that that if she doesn't win, maybe it'll turn out that she will actually be president in 2022, like Michel Houellebecq predicted in Submission. Who knows? He may have even gotten the exact year right there. But one thing that does give me a tremendous amount of optimism for the distant future, though, the very distant future, are certain technologies, things like 3D printing, for example. If that technology develops and becomes widespread and cheap to use and so on, and there's every indication that it will, people are even beginning to talk about houses being 3D printed. Granted, they're small houses, but remember, this technology is still in its infancy. But when the technology does develop and it becomes easy and super cheap to print up a fully functional, automatic weapon in your garage in like 5 minutes, and gun control laws become permanently unenforceable, then you will reach a point at which there becomes a certain definite upper limit to the amount of power that the U.S. government can exert. And when that happens, well, that will have libertarian consequences. You may not see, Ancapistan develop in the territory of the United States, but it will certainly be much freer when everybody's armed, because totalitarianism in that classic jackbooted kind of sense will become effectively impossible. There will be perhaps literal, there will be a gun behind every blade of grass, and in fact probably multiple guns. And you can then expand that trend beyond just the United States, possibly even to the whole world. It depends on how that technology develops and on how many hands it falls into. But I'm optimistic about that. I don't think that it's something that can be realistically stopped at this point. And so probably in the long run, in the very long run, I am an optimist for that reason. Although, as I said, we're in this kind of tumultuous transitional period right now where it's difficult to see what exactly will happen in the next 20 years. But for 100-year timescales, I'm inclined to be optimistic, or for even longer timescales than that. It depends. Although, of course, if Europe and the United States fails to stem the tide of third world immigration and whites are demographically replaced, well then, obviously you're not going to be seeing anything significantly libertarian emerging for quite a while, at least until, I don't know, some new evolutionary mutation emerges thousands of years hence and the process can be allowed to start again. But, who knows about anything like that. So I can't really give you anything definitive. Everything here is speculative. So I guess what I'll say in summary is, even though in the long run I'm an optimist because of things like 3D printing, it really, really depends what happens in the next few decades and whether the West is able to repel the flood of third worlders coming into its borders. And it's anybody's guess how that'll turn out. What is one thing that Length Unithar is wrong about? Okay. Well, he's wrong for not leaving a question here, for one thing. Seriously, though, a while ago, long time ago, I think I started watching Lengthy Unithar's videos way the hell back in 2012. I used to occasionally leave comments on his videos where I would correct him over something, but it would be something really minor, like a wrong date, or he got some person's name wrong, or he mixed this event up with that event. It was never anything serious. They're always like really minor things. I mean, I generally agree with the guy pretty much everywhere. He's an ANCAP, I'm an ANCAP. It's all good. But yeah, totally wrong for not leaving a question for me. What the hell, dude? Way off base. Seriously. Sad. Okay. Here we go. This is a super important and serious question. I am so glad that you asked this, David Brook. He says, "Is the water really turning the frickin' frogs gay? And how many super male vitality pills do you recommend taking per day?" Well, first of all, about the frogs. Yeah, dude. I mean, seriously. It's just so obvious that the frogs are just becoming gay as fuck. I mean, you go about your day normally, just wanting to do your thing, trying to, be normal, not bothering everybody, and then boom, left and right, there's just frogs everywhere, doing it froggy style, fucking each other in the ass. It's horrible. And you look at it and you think, what the hell is this degeneracy? Christ, get a lily pad or something. But yeah, so it's a serious problem. There really is something in the water, and it is turning the frickin' frogs gay. And I'm glad that you asked about those super male vitality pills, because that's ultimately the only way to counteract this thing. Because it doesn't just affect frogs. So how many super male vitality pills do you recommend taking per day? Very important question. I get this question all the time, so I'm just going to set down the answer once and for all so everybody knows. The answer is 6 gorillion. Now, I understand that that's an extremely difficult regimen to keep. It's very hard to stick to that, but you have to do it. It has to be 6 gorillion. One for each and every one of those Shylocks that are putting all of that shit into your water and screwing with your chemical and bodily equilibrium. It's the only way to counteract it. You have to fight fire with fire. 6 gorillion, the exact number. And it's really terrible that we have to resort to extreme measures like this. I mean, just think about it, When we exposed them to chemicals, it was always, for purposes of delousing. But now that the shoe's on the other foot and they're putting chemicals into our stuff, it's this all this horrible crap turning the frogs gay. God damn it. But yeah, 6 gorillion. I'm serious. You cannot deviate from this. It must be done, because the consequences will be just inestimable. Right. Okay. On to a less serious question now. How did you become a libertarian? Pretty easy. Like a lot of people back in 2007, during the Republican primary debates, I saw Ron Paul, just kind of go off on Rudy Giuliani and attack the whole kind of American imperium, I guess, that we're having all these stupid and pointless wars started over lies for no reason that don't benefit us, and he's condemning these things as horrific, immoral monstrosities, and I was very impressed by that. Before becoming a libertarian, I was a liberal, honestly, and that sort of began my move away from that. Although at about that same time, other things were happening as well. I was becoming aware of how much thought control there was at college campuses. And I wasn't in college yet at the time. I was still in high school in 2007. But I was, looking at colleges and that sort of thing, and it came to my attention that they have these campus speech codes and all this kind of stuff. And by all indications, it's a lot worse now than it was even just 10 years ago. But it was seeing that Ron Paul speaking at that time, and then reading his book, The Revolution, which really was the first thing to expose me to libertarian ideas. After that, I read Economics in One Lesson. I found the Mises Institute's website. As things sort of went on into 2008, and then into 2009, I watched a documentary that you can now very easily find on YouTube, but which back then was not at all easy to get hold of for free, called Indoctrinate You, which is about campus speech codes and all this other stuff. Right-wing students getting, threatened with expulsion for explaining and espousing their views for being right-wing, essentially. It's all of this stuff about this utter lock, stock, and barrel left-wing dominance of the college campuses. Now, if you watch the documentary now, it's not going to tell you anything that you don't already know, probably. This is common knowledge that college campuses are a bastion of the left. But back then in 2008, when I was in high school, this was a big deal to me, and it really exposed me to the fact that many liberals were actually quite illiberal. See, I, in my naivete back then, thought that a liberal was someone who was basically in favor of, personal freedom, which I was. And then I started seeing this. And that, in conjunction with reading Ron Paul, with learning economics, really sort of began to push me in the libertarian direction. Shortly after that, after the financial crisis, I really became interested in economics. I read Tom Wood's book Meltdown, which really actually did a lot for me. And I dived deeper into the Mises Institute stuff, and pretty soon after, I read a little book, which was actually just 2 essays put together by Bob Murphy, called Chaos Theory, where he discussed private law and private defense and how those would work. And I read that and was very interested in it, and I began exploring deeper. And eventually I started finding answers to all of these objections to the ANCAP position. And as that sort of went on, I started drifting more and more toward that view. And I think certainly by the time I started college, this is certainly before 2010, I was a full-fledged ANCAP. So 2008-ish, maybe probably by 2009, I was definitely firmly an ANCAP. And that's sort of how it's been ever since. I mean, there have been other things that have happened, but that basic view has remained. And just the whole approach, the property rights and all of that really appealed to me. That's the story. Okay, so let's go back to what historical figure would I invite for dinner. The first person that came to mind for me was actually Aaron Burr. I hesitate to say that he'd be like number one, but he's an unconventional answer, and he's someone that I find extremely interesting because he's this maligned figure in American history. And, the thing with Aaron Burr is people who don't know much about him generally condemn him. And people who have bothered to learn about his life are much more sympathetic towards him. So, in the early 19th century, he spent quite a bit of time traveling around the United States, and there were stories that he was fomenting insurrection because he was seeing the new emerging U.S. government and the forms that it was beginning to take, and he wasn't happy about them. It was taking upon itself more authority than he believed it had a right to take. And so he started going through the country and saying, hey, we fought a revolution over secession, and if you decide that you don't like what this government is doing, I mean, you can secede, you can break off, you can do that sort of thing. And he started making trouble in that way. And so predictably he was smeared. But yeah, Aaron Burr is a really interesting guy. When the Revolutionary War started, he was about 20, and he fought, and did all this, horrifically dangerous stuff in the midst of the war, getting assailed by gunfire and who knows what else, and really was quite brave then. And there's a lot of sort of romanticism surrounding that. But yeah, he just seems like an interesting guy. And what's interesting also to me is how just utterly smeared he was. Also, a funny story. There once actually was an Aaron Burr Society. It was a group of these sort of like paleocon thinkers in America, and their motto, uh, in relation to the fact that Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, was "Not soon enough," which I thought was great. But yeah, I don't know if I'd keep it just to him. I mean, there's so many other people I could think of. Um, yeah, again, it's just I'm kind of drawing a blank because it's really hard to come up with somebody. Because as soon as I think of one person, I think, well, what about this person? I can't really give you a good answer there. Sorry. All right, moving on. Okay, this is just a comment. All right, let's just switch to the screen view here, I guess. This is just a comment. I enjoy your videos. I tend to be liberal on the political spectrum, but I like the gaming out mental exercise. Iron sharpens iron. Carry on. Thank you, Jay Arnesold. Uh, making fun of the microphone. It also doubles as a dildo. Yeah, well, I guess you're gonna have to fight fire with fire. That's what you need to fight the dildo narrative, right? All right. Let's see. Congrats, buddy. Great intellectually stimulating channel. Thank you, DK. All right. All right. Oh, Spring and Felta again with another question. A thorough discussion of abstract objects would be interesting. For example, what is a universal? Is it a type of abstract object? There's this idea about the philosophical realm that objects are abstract if they have no effect on the physical world. But what about ideas, dreams, plans, and goals? These seem to be abstract, and yet people who have them go on to create great things. So it seems that these abstract objects ultimately affect the physical world. Your thoughts on this would be very enlightening. Okay. All right. First of all, when you're talking about when philosophers talk about abstract objects, they usually don't mean things like ideas, goals, dreams, etc. These are considered mental entities, and they're different from abstract objects. Now, if your worry here is that the exact distinction between these things probably can't be drawn very precisely, yeah, you're sort of right. I'm inclined to agree there. But the view of abstract objects that says that they can't influence the world, that has actually given rise to a very interesting objection to realism about universals. It's an epistemological objection, and it goes something like this. So basically, since universals are abstract objects, they therefore are causally inert. They cannot have a causal influence on the world in any way, and therefore presumably also on our minds in any way. And so if they can't causally interact with our minds, how is it that we can come to know about them? That's the problem. Well, the issue here is that this argument presumes a certain view of causality that there doesn't seem to be any grounds to accept, certainly not without its own argument. I mean, I guess the implicit idea here is that there's something about abstract universals existing in their own Platonic realm that bars them from causally interacting with other things. I mean, I don't see why that's true. Um, for instance, if you believe that there are separate physical and mental substances, presumably you believe in some form of interaction between them, whether that interaction is the Cartesian type or interaction in the hylomorphist sense, that the soul becomes just form and that it's sort of emergent form out of the properties of the material that makes up your body. In any event, you believe in interaction between different sorts of substances in that sense. So why there can't be causal interaction between abstract objects and other things outside of that supposedly Platonic realm isn't clear to me. It supposes a kind of certain view of causality that really isn't really thought about very much and that should be argued for but isn't in the context of that sort of argument. So what exactly is a universal? Well, I mean, it's a concept, right? It's I mean, take triangularity, for example, right? The idea of triangularity and all the properties that make a triangle what it is. It isn't any particular triangle, because any particular triangle that you could draw or see instantiated anywhere in the world, um, would have certain minuscule imperfections to it, which the abstract, pure idea of a triangle wouldn't have. So universals are concepts. As far as what they are, well, I mean, they could be these Platonic objects existing in some sort of realm of their own, or they could be ideas in the mind of God that sort of allowed him to sort of structure reality according to the rules that they laid out, if you're inclined to that sort of view. But in any case, they're basically just concepts that I think you need to presume at least some degree of realism about in order to be able to really make sense of reality, because full-on absolute nominalism really kind of leads to something utterly inexplicable, incomprehensible, and impossible to understand. With full nominalism taken all the way, you can't do science, you can't make sense of anything. You can't presume that relations exist, and so you can't compare anything to anything else. And you can't make any kind of general statements about anything. And when you're that hemmed in, well, good luck being able to form any kind of understanding of reality. So a universal is just some sort of concept that seems that seems necessary for any kind of a rationalistic picture or understanding of the world. And more than saying any more than that would require me to delve into particular views on various things. For instance, I mean, there's certain things you could say about are universals really ideas in the mind of God, but what does that say about God and all these other things? And what if you don't believe in God? So I'm kind of trying to keep this in the most general terms that I can. All right. Okay. There are some more questions to cover, but this has gone on for a very long time. I mean, damn. It's getting close to 3 hours now. So I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna stop the stream right now and take a little break, and then in a few minutes I'm going to get back on and answer the rest of the questions. So my apologies once again for going on as ridiculously long as I've done, but I'll try to be faster about it now, and I'll talk to you soon. See ya.